When Officer Ryan Hale lay bleeding on cold marble floors surrounded by armed gunmen, the last person he expected to burst through those bank doors was Daniel Cross, the ex-convict he'd spent months trying to destroy. In a split second, that would define two lives forever. A broken man would prove that heroism isn't about badges or uniforms. It's about the choice to save someone who hates you. This is the story of how one father's courage transformed an entire town, and why sometimes our greatest enemies become our most unlikely saviors. Tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story of redemption travels across the world. The morning sun cast long shadows across Millhaven's Main Street as Daniel Cross pushed through the diner's back door, his work boots heavy against the cracked linoleum. The smell of bacon grease and old coffee hung in the air, like a familiar curse one he'd learned to embrace over the past 8 months. His hands scarred from years of protection work and marked by 2 months of washing dishes, moved with practiced efficiency as he tied his apron. "You're late again, Cross." Martha's voice cut through the kitchen's ambient noise. The diner's owner, a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much of small-town drama, stood near the coffee machine with her arms crossed. But there was no real malice in her tone, just the tired resignation of someone who'd grown to understand the weight Daniel carried. "I'm sorry, Martha. Lily had a nightmare again." Daniel's voice was quiet, respectful. He'd learned that humility was his shield in this town where everyone knew his story, where whispers followed him like shadows. Martha's expression softened slightly. She'd been the only person willing to hire him when he'd walked into Millhaven 8 months ago, carrying nothing but a duffel bag and his daughter's hand. "The dead wife dreams." Daniel nodded, not trusting his voice. Sarah's death still felt like a fresh wound, a construction accident that had taken her from them in an instant, leaving him with nothing but memories and a 9-year-old daughter who asked too many questions about why Mommy wasn't coming home. "Well, get started then. Tuesday breakfast rush waits for no man's grief." Martha's words were gruff, but she squeezed his shoulder as she passed a small gesture that meant everything in a world that had mostly turned its back on him. The morning routine began like every other. Daniel moved between the dish pit and the kitchen, invisible to most customers, just another piece of the diner's worn furniture. He'd learned to find peace in the simplicity of it. The hot water, the endless stack of plates, the mindless repetition that kept his thoughts from wandering too far into the darkness. Through the service window, he could see the morning regulars settling into their usual spots. Old Pete, the retired mechanic, nursed his black coffee in booth 3. The Henderson twins' local farmers debated grain prices over eggs and toast. Mrs. Chen, who ran the flower shop next door, picked at her oatmeal while reading yesterday's newspaper. It was the kind of small-town tableau that might have comforted him once back when he had a different life, when he wore expensive suits and protected people who could afford his particular set of skills. Now it just reminded him of how far he'd fallen, how completely his world had collapsed. The bell above the front door chimed, and Daniel didn't need to look up to know who had entered. The conversation in the dining room shifted, voices dropping to hushed tones. The familiar sound of heavy boots on linoleum announced the arrival of Officer Ryan Hale. Daniel's hands tightened around the plate he was scrubbing, but he kept his eyes down, focusing on a stubborn stain that probably wasn't even there. Through the service window, he caught glimpses of Hale settling into his usual spot at the counter, his police uniform crisp and intimidating, even in the gentle morning light. "Morning, Officer Hale," Martha called out, her voice professionally cheerful. "The usual." "Yeah, Martha, coffee black, and maybe some of that pie if it's fresh." Hale's voice carried that particular authority that came with a badge, but Daniel had learned to hear the underlying tension, the edge that suggested a man fighting his own battles. Daniel kept washing dishes, but his peripheral vision tracked Hale's movements, The officer's in his mid-30s, with close-cropped brown hair, and the kind of solid build that suggested both natural strength and hours in a gym. But it was his eyes that told the real story, pale blue, and constantly scanning, as if looking for threats, or more specifically, looking for Daniel. "You know," Hale said, his voice carrying just loud enough for the kitchen staff to hear, "I was talking to my buddy over in county yesterday. Interesting conversation about background checks and employment practices." Daniel's hands stilled for just a moment before resuming their work. Martha's response was quick and firm. "My hiring practices are my business, Ryan." "Oh, I'm not suggesting anything improper." Hale continued stirring sugar into his coffee with deliberate slowness. "Just thinking out loud about community safety, you know. About the kinds of people we trust around our food, our families." The words hit Daniel like physical blows, each one carefully chosen or to maximum impact. He'd heard variations of this conversation dozens of times over the past months. Hale's subtle campaign to make his life impossible. The officer never crossed the line into outright harassment. He was too smart for that. But he painted his picture with careful strokes, reminding everyone who would listen about Daniel's past. "Ryan," Martha's voice held a warning note, "drink your coffee and mind your business. I'm just saying people have a right to know when there's a convicted felon handling their breakfast." Hale's voice remained conversational, almost friendly, which somehow made it worse. Especially one with a history of violence. Daniel set down the plate he'd been washing and took a slow, steady breath. He'd been a bodyguard for 12 years before his arrest had protected politicians, celebrities, and wealthy businessmen from threats both real and imagined. He'd been good at his job, respected in his field. The conviction that had destroyed his career assault charges, stemming from an incident where he'd protected his client from an armed attacker, had been technically justified but legally complicated. The system had failed him as it failed so many others. A good lawyer might have gotten him off with community service, but good lawyers cost money he didn't have. Instead, he'd served 18 months and emerged to find his reputation destroyed, his career over, and his wife struggling to hold their family together. "Daniel's been nothing but reliable," Martha said firmly. "He works hard, shows up on time, and keeps to himself. That's more than I can say for some people." Hale chuckled, but there was no humor in the sound. "I'm sure he does. Ex-cons often make model employees when they're being watched." Through the service window, Daniel caught a glimpse of the other customers. Some were pointedly ignoring the conversation, uncomfortable with the tension, but unwilling to get involved. Others were listening with obvious interest, storing away details to share later over backyard fences and grocery store aisles. This was Hale's real skill, not the direct confrontation that Daniel could have handled, but the slow poison of innuendo and implication. The officer understood small-town dynamics, knew how to plant seeds of doubt that would grow and spread until Daniel's presence became a source of constant unease. "You know what I find interesting?" Hale continued, apparently addressing his coffee cup, but speaking for the room's benefit. "How people can just show up in a town like this, with a story that doesn't quite add up, and everyone's supposed to just accept it. Wife dies in a construction accident, husband shows up here with a kid and a criminal record. Makes a person wonder what the real story is." Daniel's jaw clenched involuntarily. Hale's words danced dangerously close to the truth, not the truth about Sarah's death, which had been genuinely accidental, but the truth about why Daniel had chosen Millhaven as their refuge. He'd been running not from the law, but from creditors, from the wreckage of his former life, from people who knew his story and had already made their judgments. Millhaven had seemed like salvation, a small town, where he could start over, where Lily could grow up away from the chaos that had consumed their world. But he hadn't counted on Ryan Hale. "That's enough," Martha's voice cut through the tension like a blade. Ryan, I've known you since you were in diapers, and I'm telling you to drop this. I'm just making conversation, Martha. You're being a bully, and it's not becoming of that uniform. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken tensions. Daniel used the moment to glance through the service window, catching his first clear look at Hale in several days. The officer appeared calm on the surface, but Daniel's trained eye caught the subtle signs of stress, the tight line of his shoulders, the way his fingers drummed against his coffee cup, the slight tremor in his hands that suggested either too much caffeine or not enough alcohol. Ryan Hale was a man fighting his own demons, Daniel realized. The harassment, the constant needling. It wasn't really about Daniel at all. It was about control, about having someone safe to target when the world felt like it was spinning out of control. The realization should have brought understanding, maybe even sympathy. Instead, it filled Daniel with a cold anger. He could handle being the target of someone's rage, could absorb the hatred and move forward. But Lily was watching, learning, forming her understanding of the world based on how it treated her father. Daddy! Lily's voice from the diner's front door cut through Daniel's thoughts like a lightning bolt. She stood in the entrance, backpack slung over one shoulder, her long brown hair catching the morning light. At 9 years old, she had her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn chin, and right now both were focused on the scene playing out before her. The diner fell silent. Every eye turned to the little girl who had just walked into the middle of an adult confrontation she shouldn't have to witness. Daniel felt his heart sink as he saw Lily's expression change, confusion and hurt flickering across her features as she took in the atmosphere. "Hi, baby," Daniel called out softly, stepping out from behind the service window. "What are you doing here? You're supposed to be walking to school." "I forgot my lunch money." Lily's voice was small, uncertain. Her eyes moved between Daniel and Hale, trying to understand the tension she could feel, but not quite comprehend. Hale turned on his stool to face her, and Daniel saw something shift in the officer's expression. For a moment, the hard mask slipped, replaced by something that might have been shame or recognition. Here was a child innocent and vulnerable, caught in the crossfire of adult cruelties. "Well, hello there," Hale said, his voice gentler than it had been moments before. "You must be Lily. I'm Officer Hale." Lily looked at him with the directness that only children possess. "Are you the policeman who doesn't like my daddy?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Daniel felt his breath catch, proud of his daughter's courage, even as he worried about the consequences. Around the diner, customers shifted uncomfortably, suddenly fascinated by their breakfast plates. Hale's face reddened slightly. That's not exactly." He stopped, seeming to struggle with how to respond to such honest directness. "I'm just doing my job, sweetheart. Making sure everyone in town is safe." "My daddy keeps me safe," Lily said with simple conviction. "He makes me breakfast and reads me stories and checks for monsters under my bed. He's the safest person I know." Daniel felt tears threaten at the corner of his eyes. In the mouth of his daughter, his life took on a different shape, not the story of an ex-convict trying to rebuild, but the story of a father doing everything he could to protect and provide for his child. "I'm sure he does," Hale said quietly. And for just a moment, Daniel heard something genuine in the officer's voice. Something that suggested beneath the uniform and the attitude there might still be a decent man. But the moment passed quickly. Hale turned back to his coffee, the mask sliding back into place. "You should get to school, little girl. Education's important." Daniel moved quickly to his daughter's side, pulling a crumpled $5 bill from his pocket money that should have gone toward groceries, but would now ensure Lily had lunch. "Here, baby, and next time just call the diner if you forget something." Martha will make sure I get the message." Lily took the money, but didn't immediately leave. Instead, she looked up at her father with eyes that seemed far too old for her face. "Daddy, why doesn't he like you?" The question struck at the heart of everything Daniel had been trying to protect her from. How do you explain to a 9-year-old that the world isn't always fair, that sometimes good people are judged by their worst moments, that adults can be petty and cruel for reasons that have nothing to do with logic or justice? "Some people just need time to get to know us," Daniel said, finally kneeling down to her level. "We're new here and change makes some folks uncomfortable. But we'll show them who we really are, okay, one day at a time." Lily nodded solemnly, accepting the explanation with the resilience that had gotten her through their mother's death and the upheaval that followed. She hugged Daniel tightly, her small arms wrapping around his neck with fierce love. "I love you, Daddy," she whispered into his ear. "I love you too, baby. More than all the stars in the sky." She pulled back, smiled at him with Sarah's smile, and headed for the door. As she passed Hale's stool, she paused and looked up at him with that same direct gaze. "I hope you have a nice day, Officer Hale," she said politely. "Maybe someday you and my daddy can be friends." Then she was gone, the bell chiming her exit, and leaving behind a silence that felt different from the one before, heavier, more complicated, charged with questions that had no easy answers. Hale stared at his coffee for a long moment, his shoulders tense. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before. "Cute kid," he said to no one in particular. Daniel returned to the kitchen without responding, but something had shifted in the dynamic. Lily's simple honesty had accomplished what months of Daniel's patience and dignity couldn't. She had reminded everyone present that they were talking about a family, about a little girl who loved her father and deserved better than the adult world's cruelties. The breakfast rush resumed its normal rhythm, but Daniel could feel the change in the atmosphere. Conversations were more subdued, and when he looked through the service window, he caught several customers glancing his way with expressions that seemed more thoughtful than judgmental. Hale finished his coffee in silence and left exact change on the counter, no tip. As he headed for the door, he paused near the kitchen entrance where Daniel was working. "Cross," he said quietly, just loud enough for Daniel to hear. Daniel looked up, meeting the officer's eyes directly for the first time in weeks. "That's a good kid you've got there," Hale said. "Make sure she stays that way." The words could have been interpreted as a threat, but something in Hale's tone suggested otherwise. There was a weight to them, a complexity that spoke to deeper currents Daniel didn't fully understand. Then Hale was gone, leaving Daniel to puzzle over the interaction as he returned to his endless cycle of dishes and doubt. The rest of the morning passed quietly. Martha made no reference to the confrontation, but Daniel noticed she assigned him to prep work in the back room, where he'd be less visible to customers. It was a kindness he knew, but also a reminder of his place in the world, always just out of sight, always walking the line between acceptance and rejection. During his lunch break, Daniel walked to the elementary school to catch a glimpse of Lily at recess. It had become a ritual this midday, checking in a way to reassure himself that she was okay, that the world wasn't being too cruel to her in his absence. He stood at the fence that bordered the playground, watching as she played with a small group of children. She seemed happy, normal, unaware that some of her classmates' parents had probably heard about the morning's incident by now, that the story would be retold and embellished at dinner tables across town. "She's a resilient little thing, isn't she?" Daniel turned to find Mrs. Patterson, Lily's teacher, approaching with a gentle smile. A woman in her 40s with kind eyes and graying hair, she was one of the few people in town who had treated Daniel with consistent respect. "She is," Daniel agreed. "Sometimes I think she's handling all this better than I am." "Children are remarkably adaptable," Mrs. Patterson said, joining him at the fence. But they also absorb more than we think they do. She knows things are difficult, even if she doesn't understand all the reasons why. Daniel nodded, watching as Lily helped a younger child who had fallen on the playground. Even at 9, she had an instinct for kindness, for protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. It was something she'd gotten from Sarah, a generosity of spirit that had survived everything they'd been through. "How is she doing in school?" Daniel asked. "Academically, she's excellent. Above grade level in reading and math. Socially." Mrs. Patterson paused, choosing her words carefully. "Some of the other children are curious about her story. Children hear their parents talking, and they ask questions." Daniel felt his stomach tighten. "Is she being ostracized?" "No, nothing like that. Most of the children like her. She's funny and kind and stands up for kids who are being picked on. But she's also learned to be guarded about certain topics. She doesn't talk much about life before Millhaven or about her mother. That's not uncommon for children who've experienced loss, but combined with the social dynamics. In town, it means she's carrying more than she should." The weight of Mrs. Patterson's words settled on Daniel's shoulders like a physical burden. He'd come to Millhaven hoping to give Lily a normal childhood, a chance to grow up without the stigma of his mistakes. Instead, he'd brought her into a different kind of conflict, one that was perhaps more insidious, because it was wrapped in small-town politeness and unspoken judgments. "What can I do?" he asked quietly. "Keep being the father you are," Mrs. Patterson said simply. "Children need stability and love more than they need social acceptance. Lily has both of those things from you. The rest will work itself out." Daniel hoped she was right, but as he watched his daughter navigate the complex social dynamics of the playground, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was failing her in ways he didn't fully understand. The afternoon brought its own challenges. As Daniel worked in the diner's kitchen, he overheard fragments of conversation from the dining room, speculation about the morning's confrontation, theories about his past judgments, about his fitness as a parent. Most of it was couched in concerned tones, the kind of gossip that masqueraded as community care, but served primarily to reinforce social hierarchies and exclude those who didn't conform. By the time his shift ended, Daniel felt drained in a way that had nothing to do with physical labor. The emotional toll of constant vigilance, of always being watched and judged, was exhausting in ways he struggled to articulate. He picked up Lily from the after-school program, and they walked home to their small apartment above the hardware store. It wasn't much, 2 bedrooms, a tiny kitchen furniture from thrift stores and Walmart, but it was theirs, the first stable home they'd had since Sarah's death. "Daddy," Lily said, as they climbed the narrow stairs, "why was that policeman angry at you this morning?" Daniel had been dreading this question all day, but he'd also been preparing for it. He'd learned that Lily responded better to honesty than to evasion, though he always filtered the truth through what she could handle. "Officer Hale doesn't know me very well," Daniel said carefully as they entered their apartment. "Sometimes when people don't know each other, they make assumptions based on limited information." "What kind of assumptions?" Daniel set his keys on the small table by the door and helped Lily out of her backpack. "You know how sometimes when you meet a new kid at school, you might think they're mean or unfriendly, but then you get to know them and realize they're actually really nice. It's kind of like that, except with adults. The assumptions can be more serious and harder to change." Lily considered this as she settled at the kitchen table with her homework. "So he thinks you're a bad person. He thinks he knows things about me that make him worried about having me in town," Daniel said, pulling ingredients from the refrigerator to start dinner. "But the things he thinks he knows are only part of the story, and they don't tell him anything about who I am now, or what kind of father I am to you." "Are you a bad person, Daddy?" The question hit Daniel like a physical blow. He stopped what he was doing and knelt beside Lily's chair, looking directly into her eyes, Sarah's eyes, trusting and seeking truth. "I've made mistakes, baby," he said quietly. "Serious mistakes that hurt people and had consequences. But I'm not the same person I was when I made those mistakes, and I'm trying every day to be the kind of man you can be proud of." Lily reached out and touched his face with her small hand. "I'm already proud of you, Daddy. You take care of me, and you work hard, and you make really good pancakes." Despite everything, the stress, the uncertainty, the constant low-level anxiety that had become his baseline, Daniel found himself smiling. In his daughter's simple logic, goodness was measured not by past failures, but by present actions, not by social standing, but by the quality of pancakes and bedtime stories. "I love you, Lily Cross," he said, pulling her into a hug. "I love you too, Daniel Cross," she replied, using his full name in the formal way that always made him laugh. They settled into their evening routine dinner homework, help a chapter from the book they were reading together, bath time, and finally the ritual checking for monsters under the bed and in the closet. It was a routine born of necessity after Sarah's death, when Lily's nightmares had made sleep impossible for both of them. As Daniel tucked her in, Lily looked up at him with serious eyes. "Daddy, do you think Officer Hale has someone to check under his bed for monsters?" The question was so unexpected, so purely Lily, that Daniel had to pause to consider it. "What makes you ask that?" He seemed sad today, like maybe he has monsters too, but nobody to help him with them. Daniel felt something shift in his chest, a recognition of the truth his 9-year-old daughter had seen more clearly than he had. Hale's antagonism, his need to control and diminish it, came from a place of pain, not strength. It came from his own monsters, his own fears, his own sense of being alone in the world. "Maybe he does," Daniel said softly. "Maybe that's why he's angry all the time." "Maybe we could help him," Lily suggested. "Maybe if we were really, really nice to him, he'd remember that not everyone is scary." Daniel kissed his daughter's forehead, marveling at the generosity of her heart. "Maybe we could, baby. But right now, let's focus on keeping our own monsters away, okay?" Lily nodded and snuggled deeper into her covers. "Sing the song, Daddy." Daniel's voice, rough from years of cigarettes he'd given up when Lily was born, filled the small room with the lullaby Sarah used to sing, a gentle melody about ships sailing home across safe harbors and stars that watched over sleeping children. When Lily's breathing had deepened into sleep, Daniel made his way to his own room and sat on the edge of his narrow bed. Through the thin walls, he could hear the sounds of the town settling into evening cars passing on Main Street, the distant sound of television programs, the ordinary noises of ordinary lives. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his limited contacts, pausing at a number he hadn't called in months. Marcus had been his partner in the protection business, the one person who had stood by him through the trial and its aftermath. Daniel had stopped taking his calls when the shame became too overwhelming, but now he found himself wanting to hear a friendly voice. The phone rang twice before Marcus answered. "Danny, Jesus, man, I was starting to think you'd fallen off the face of the earth." "Hi, Marcus." Daniel's voice came out rougher than he'd intended. "How are you? Better question is, how are you? And don't give me some polite bullshit. I can hear it in your voice, something's wrong." Marcus had always been able to read him, a skill that had made them effective partners and remained even across the distance and silence. Daniel found himself pouring out the story of the past months, the move to Millhaven, the job at the diner, the constant harassment from Hale, his fears about Lily's future. "So let me get this straight," Marcus said when Daniel finished. "You're washing dishes for this asshole cop's entertainment, and you're just taking it. It's not that simple. The hell it's not. Danny, I've seen you face down armed gangs without breaking a sweat. You're letting some small-town bully push you around. Because why? Because you feel guilty about the past. Because I have a daughter to think about, Daniel said firmly. Because fighting back would only make things worse for her. Because this is the life we have now, and I need to make it work. Marcus was quiet for a moment. What would Sarah say about this? The question hit Daniel like a sucker punch. Sarah had been fierce in her protection of family, unwilling to let anyone diminish the people she loved. She would have hated seeing him accept Hale's treatment, would have fought back with words and dignity, and the kind of moral authority that made people reconsider their positions. She would have handled it better than I am, Daniel admitted. Maybe. Or maybe she would have done exactly what you're doing, whatever it takes to protect Lily. But Danny, you can't protect her by disappearing. Kids need to see their parents stand up for themselves, need to learn that dignity matters. After they hung up, Daniel sat in the darkness of his small room, turning Marcus's words over in his mind. The truth was, he didn't know how to navigate this new world, where his past followed him like a shadow, where his daughter's future depended on his ability to rebuild not just his life, but his reputation. Outside his window, Millhaven slept peacefully, unaware of the drama playing out in its margins. Somewhere in the darkness, Ryan Hale was probably dealing with his own sleepless nights, his own guilt and regret. Somewhere else, other families were tucking their children into bed, without worrying about social acceptance or whispered judgments. Daniel had come to Millhaven seeking redemption, a chance to prove that people could change, that past mistakes didn't have to define future possibilities. But redemption, he was learning, wasn't something you could simply claim. It had to be earned, demonstrated, lived out one day at a time in the face of doubt and hostility. As he finally drifted toward sleep, Daniel thought about Lily's suggestion that they could help Hale with his monsters. It seemed naive, impossibly optimistic in the face of the officer's sustained antagonism. But then again, Lily had always seen possibilities that adults missed, had always believed in the fundamental goodness of people, even when that goodness was hidden beneath layers of hurt and fear. Maybe she was right. Maybe the path to redemption wasn't just about proving his own worth, but about recognizing the worth in others, even those who seemed determined to be his enemies. The thought followed him into an uneasy sleep where dreams of Sarah mixed with images of Lily, growing up in a world that judged her father, and where Ryan Hale appeared not as an antagonist, but as another broken man trying to find his way through the darkness, alone and angry, and desperately in need of someone to believe in his capacity for goodness. Tomorrow would bring another day of careful navigation, another chance to prove himself worthy of his daughter's love and his community's acceptance. But tonight, for the first time in months, Daniel Cross allowed himself to imagine that redemption might be possible not just for him, but for all of them, broken people trying to build something better from the ruins of their mistakes. The small town of Millhaven slept on, unaware that change was coming, that the quiet man washing dishes in the diner and the angry cop patrolling its streets were about to discover that courage and compassion could transform even the most unlikely circumstances, that heroes weren't born from perfection, but forged in the fires of sacrifice and unexpected grace. The following week brought an unseasonable warmth to Millhaven, the kind of Indian summer that made people linger on their porches and keep their windows open late into the evening. Daniel found himself walking to work earlier each morning, savoring the quiet streets before the town fully awakened, before the weight of constant observation settled on his shoulders like a familiar burden. It was during one of these early morning walks that he first noticed the changes in Ryan Hale's routine. The officer's patrol car sat outside Murphy's bar longer than usual, sometimes still there when Daniel passed on his way home from the diner. The bar didn't open until noon, which meant Hale was either sitting in his car doing paperwork or more likely dealing with whatever demons drove him to park outside a place that sold the kind of temporary peace that came in bottles. Daniel understood the temptation. There had been nights after Sarah's death when he'd stood outside liquor stores, his hand on the door, knowing that inside lay a few hours of blessed numbness. But Lily's face would appear in his mind, her trust and need keeping him tethered to sobriety and responsibility. "You're early again," Martha observed as Daniel tied his apron Thursday morning. Her voice carried a note of concern that had become more pronounced over the past weeks. "Everything okay at home?" "Lily's been sleeping better," Daniel replied. Which was true, but not the whole story. The real truth was that sleep had become elusive for him, his nights filled with restless energy and circular thoughts about the precarious nature of their new life. "That's good to hear." Martha poured herself a cup of coffee and leaned against the prep counter. "Listen, Daniel, I've been meaning to talk to you about something." Daniel's hands stilled on the apron strings. In his experience, conversations that began this way rarely ended well. "What's on your mind?" "The Henderson twins were in yesterday afternoon, and they mentioned they're looking for some part-time help with their harvest. Good money cash under the table if you're interested. Might be a way to put some extra aside for Lily's future." The offer was generous, and Daniel recognized it as Martha's way of helping without making it feel like charity. But he also understood the subtext. Extra money meant options, meant the ability to leave Millhaven if the situation with Hale continued to deteriorate. "I appreciate the thought, Martha, but I'm not sure I can manage both jobs and still be there for Lily when she needs me." "Course not," Martha agreed quickly. "Just thought I'd mention it. Though between you and me, having some financial cushion might not be a bad idea. Small towns can be unpredictable." Before Daniel could ask what she meant, the conversation was interrupted by the familiar chime of the front doorbell. Through the service window, he saw Mrs. Chen from the flower shop enter, her usual cheerful demeanor replaced by something that looked like distress. "Martha, thank goodness you're open early," Mrs. Chen said, her voice higher than usual. "I need to use your phone. Mine's down and I need to call the police." "What's wrong, honey?" Martha moved quickly to the front counter, Daniel following close behind. "It's my shop," Mrs. Chen said, her hands shaking slightly. "Someone broke in last night, smashed the front window, tore up the flowers, made a real mess of things. I don't think they took anything who steals flowers, but the damage is considerable." Daniel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Random vandalism wasn't unheard of in small towns, but the timing felt suspect. Just as he was starting to feel like maybe possibly the community was beginning to accept him. Something like this happened to one of the few business owners who had been consistently kind to him. "Of course, use the phone," Martha said, guiding Mrs. Chen to the counter. Daniel put on a fresh pot of coffee. "She looks like she could use some." As Mrs. Chen made her call, Daniel found himself listening to her description of the damage. Broken glass, destroyed inventory, threatening graffiti spray-painted on the walls. It painted a picture of deliberate malice rather than random mischief. 20 minutes later, Ryan Hale arrived in response to the call. He entered the diner with his usual authority, but Daniel noticed immediately that something was off. The officer's uniform was wrinkled, his usually precise appearance slightly disheveled. There was a faint smell of alcohol about him, not strong enough to suggest he was currently intoxicated, but persistent enough to indicate that the previous evening had involved significant drinking. "Mrs. Chen," Hale said, pulling out a small notebook. "I understand you've had some trouble at your shop." "Yes, Officer Hale. Someone broke in last night, made a terrible mess. I've been in business here for 15 years, never had anything like this happen." Hale began taking notes, his pen moving across the paper with mechanical precision. But Daniel could see the slight tremor in his hand, the way his eyes seemed to have difficulty focusing. Whatever was driving Hale to park outside Murphy's bar was clearly taking its toll. "Any idea who might have done this?" Hale asked. "Anyone you've had disputes with customers who might have been unhappy?" Mrs. Chen shook her head. "No, nothing like that. Everyone in town has been so supportive of my business. I can't imagine who would do such a thing." Hale's gaze swept the diner, pausing when it landed on Daniel. For just a moment their eyes met, and Daniel saw something unexpected there, not the usual hostility, but a kind of desperate searching, as if Hale was looking for answers to questions he couldn't articulate. "I'll need to take a look at the scene," Hale said, closing his notebook. "Mrs. Chen, if you think of anything else, anyone who might have had reason to target your business, give me a call." After Hale and Mrs. Chen left the diner filled with the usual breakfast crowd, but the conversation was dominated by speculation about the break-in. Daniel listened to the theories being floated, teenagers acting out someone from out of town, passing through, maybe even someone with a grudge against Mrs. Chen specifically. "It's probably nothing," old Pete said from his usual booth. "Kids these days don't have enough to keep them busy. In my day, we had chores and responsibilities. Now they just roam around looking for trouble." But Daniel noticed that several conversations quieted when he passed their tables, and he caught fragments of whispered speculation that made his stomach clench with familiar dread. Coincidence that this happens now? Never had this kind of trouble before. Makes you wonder who might be attracting the wrong element. The implication was clear even if no one was bold enough to state it directly. His presence in town was somehow connected to this act of vandalism, either as a direct cause or as a symptom of the same underlying problem. It didn't matter that he'd been home with Lily all evening, that he had no motive to harm Mrs. Chen, that the accusation made no logical sense. In the court of small-town opinion, correlation was often indistinguishable from causation. During his lunch break, Daniel walked past Mrs. Chen's flower shop to assess the damage for himself. The front window had been boarded up with plywood, but through the gaps he could see the destruction inside: overturned displays, scattered flowers, broken pottery. Someone had spent considerable time and energy creating this chaos, far more than would be required for a simple theft or random act of mischief. Terrible thing, isn't it? Daniel turned to find Father McKinnon, the elderly priest from St. Mary's Catholic Church, standing beside him. A thin man in his 70s with kind eyes and a shock of white hair, Father McKinnon was one of the few people in town who seemed immune to the social pressures that influenced others' treatment of Daniel. "Yes, it is," Daniel replied. "Mrs. Chen's always been good to everyone in town. She didn't deserve this." "No, she didn't," Father McKinnon agreed. "But then most victims of violence don't deserve their suffering. The question isn't what Mrs. Chen did to invite this, but what we as a community are going to do to prevent it from happening again." Daniel appreciated the priest's perspective, but he also heard the underlying message. Whatever was happening in Millhaven, whether it was connected to his presence or not, the community would need to come together to address it. And that meant either including him as a full member of that community or determining that he was part of the problem. "Father," Daniel said carefully, "do you think this was random, or do you think someone was sending a message?" Father McKinnon considered the question thoughtfully. "In my experience, Mr. Cross, random violence is actually quite rare. Most destructive acts stem from pain, anger, or fear. Someone who does this much damage is usually trying to communicate something, even if they're not entirely conscious of what that message might be." "And what do you think they were trying to communicate?" "That's harder to say. Could be anger at Mrs. Chen specifically, though I can't imagine what she might have done to provoke such a response. Could be anger at the town in general, or at changes they perceive in the community. Or it could be someone acting out their own internal struggles, using property destruction as a way to externalize pain they can't otherwise express. Father McKinnon's words echoed Daniel's earlier thoughts about Hale's behavior. People in pain often lashed out at targets that seemed safe or convenient, regardless of whether those targets bore any responsibility for their suffering. "Father, may I ask you something?" "Of course." When someone has made serious mistakes in their past, hurt people, caused damage, is redemption really possible? Or are some things unforgivable? Father McKinnon smiled gently. "Mr. Cross, if I didn't believe in redemption, I'd be in the wrong line of work. But redemption isn't something that's granted from outside, it's something that's built through actions, choices, and time. The question isn't whether you deserve forgiveness for your past mistakes. The question is what kind of person you're choosing to be today and tomorrow and every day after that." That evening, as Daniel helped Lily with her homework, he found himself thinking about the priest's words. Redemption as a daily choice rather than a destination. The idea was both comforting and daunting. It meant that his past didn't have to define his future, but it also meant that the work of becoming a better person would never really end. "Daddy," Lily said, looking up from her math worksheet. "Some kids at school were talking about Mrs. Chen's flower shop. They said someone broke all her pretty flowers." "That's right, baby. Someone made a big mess in her shop last night. Why would someone do that? Mrs. Chen gives me free flower stickers sometimes when we walk past her shop." Daniel struggled with how to explain senseless destruction to a 9-year-old. Sometimes people who are hurting inside do things that hurt other people. It doesn't make it right, but it helps explain why it happens. Like when Tommy Martinez pushed Sarah Williams on the playground because his parents are getting divorced. Daniel was continually amazed by his daughter's ability to draw connections between seemingly disparate events. Yes, exactly like that. Sometimes when people are dealing with big problems, they take their anger out on people who don't deserve it. "Do you think the person who hurt Mrs. Chen's shop is sorry now?" "I don't know, baby. I hope so. I hope they realize that what they did was wrong and find a better way to deal with whatever was making them angry." Lily nodded seriously, then returned to her math problems. But Daniel could see her processing the information, trying to fit this new understanding of adult behavior into her worldview. It was another small loss of innocence, another reminder that the world contained cruelties she was still too young to fully comprehend. The weekend brought an unexpected visitor. Daniel was working in their small garden behind the apartment building, a project he'd started to give them access to fresh vegetables and to provide Lily with a connection to growing things when a shadow fell across his work area. He looked up to see Ryan Hale standing at the edge of the garden plot, no longer in uniform, but wearing civilian clothes that somehow made him seem smaller, more vulnerable. The officer's face was haggard with dark circles under his eyes, and the kind of pallor that suggested too little sleep and too much alcohol. "Cross," Hale said, his voice lacking its usual authority. Daniel sat back on his heels, dirt-stained gloves in his hands. "Officer Hale, is there something I can help you with?" Hale looked around the small garden, taking in the neat rows of vegetables, the carefully tended tomato plants, the small scarecrow that Lily had insisted they build together. "You did all this yourself?" "Lily helped," Daniel replied carefully. "She wanted to learn where food comes from." "It's nice," Hale said, and the admission seemed to cost him something. "Peaceful." They stood in awkward silence for a moment, two men who had been locked in an undeclared war suddenly finding themselves in neutral territory. Daniel waited, sensing that Hale had come here for a reason, but wasn't sure how to articulate it. "Look," Hale finally said, "I want to ask you something about the break-in at Mrs. Chen's place." Daniel felt his defenses rise immediately. I was home with Lily all evening. We made dinner, did homework, and watched a movie. She can verify that. That's not... Hale stopped, ran a hand through his hair. I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm asking if you've noticed anything unusual lately. Anyone hanging around who shouldn't be any strangers in town, anything that seemed off. The question was so unexpected that Daniel took a moment to process it. Hale was asking for his help, treating him like a potential source of information rather than a suspect. It was a small shift, but significant. No, Daniel said slowly. Nothing out of the ordinary. Though to be honest, I'm probably not the best person to ask. I don't know the town well enough to recognize when something's off. Hale nodded, seeming to accept this response. But he didn't leave, instead continuing to study the garden with an intensity that suggested his mind was elsewhere. Officer Hale, Daniel said carefully. Are you all right? The question seemed to catch Hale off guard. His eyes snapped back to Daniel's face, searching for signs of mockery or manipulation. Finding neither, his shoulders sagged slightly. No, he said quietly. No, I don't think I am. It was such an unexpected moment of honesty that Daniel found himself at a loss for words. Here was the man who had spent months trying to make his life impossible, suddenly revealing his own vulnerability in Daniel's small garden. Is there anything I can do to help? Daniel asked, the words coming out before he could fully consider them. Hale laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. You want to help me after everything I've put you through? We're all just trying to get by, Daniel said simply. If you're struggling with something that doesn't disappear just because we've had our differences. Hale studied Daniel's face for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether the offer was genuine. Why? He asked finally. Why would you want to help me? Daniel thought about Lily's words from weeks earlier, her suggestion that maybe they could help Hale with his monsters. Because my daughter thinks you're sad and lonely, he said, and because she's usually right about people. Something shifted in Hale's expression, surprise maybe, or recognition. Your kid's got good instincts. She does, sometimes better than mine. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the tension between them not entirely gone, but transformed into something more complex, more human. The break-in at Mrs. Chen's, Hale said eventually. It wasn't random. Someone was specifically targeting her, but I can't figure out why. She's got no enemies that I can find, no recent disputes, no reason for anyone to want to hurt her. What makes you think it was targeted? The graffiti. It wasn't just random tags or curse words. Someone wrote, "Go back where you came from," on her wall. Mrs. Chen's been here 15 years, but she's still seen as an outsider by some people. Daniel felt a chill of recognition. The same prejudice that made some townspeople suspicious of Mrs. Chen's foreign origins was likely contributing to their suspicion of his own outsider status. Do you have any leads? A few. But here's the thing. Hale paused, seeming to weigh how much to reveal. I think whoever did this might escalate. The level of anger, the personal nature of the message, it suggests someone who's been building up resentment for a while. Mrs. Chen might not be the only target. The implication hung in the air between them. If someone was targeting perceived outsiders, Daniel and Lily could easily be next. What are you going to do? Daniel asked. My job, Hale said, but his voice lacked conviction. Investigate, follow leads, try to prevent it from happening again. And if that's not enough, Hale looked directly at Daniel for the first time since arriving. Then I guess we'll find out what this town is really made of. After Hale left, Daniel found himself unable to concentrate on the garden work. The conversation had shifted something fundamental in their relationship, creating a tentative alliance born of shared vulnerability and mutual recognition of the dangers they faced. That evening, as he tucked Lily into bed, she asked about their visitor. "Was that Officer Hale in our garden today?" "Yes, it was. He looked sad just like I thought. Did you tell him about checking for monsters?" Daniel smiled despite his concerns. "Not exactly, but we talked about helping each other with problems." "That's good," Lily said sleepily. "Everyone needs help sometimes." As Daniel turned out the lights and headed to his own room, he reflected on the strange turn his life had taken. A year ago, he'd been a successful bodyguard with a beautiful wife and a stable future. Now he was washing dishes in a small town, forming an unlikely alliance with a troubled police officer, and learning that redemption was more complicated than he'd ever imagined. But there were also unexpected gifts in this new life. Lily's resilience and wisdom, Martha's quiet kindness, Father McKinnon's gentle guidance, and now perhaps the possibility that even his greatest antagonist might become something more like an ally. The next few days passed quietly, with no further incidents of vandalism or harassment. Daniel began to hope that maybe the break-in had been an isolated event, that whoever was responsible had gotten whatever they needed out of their system and would move on to other concerns. That hope was shattered Tuesday morning when he arrived at work to find Martha standing outside the diner, staring at the front windows. Someone had spray-painted "Criminals Not Welcome" across the glass in red letters, along with a crude drawing of a noose. "How long has it been like this?" Daniel asked, his voice tight with anger and fear. "I don't know. I got here 20 minutes ago and found it like this." Martha's voice was shaky, but there was steel underneath it. "I've already called the police." Daniel stared at the graffiti, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. Whether or not he was the intended target, his presence had clearly contributed to this escalation. The person responsible was sending a message not just to him, but to anyone who employed him, supported him, or showed him kindness. "Martha," he said quietly, "maybe it's time for me to move on. Find somewhere else to—" "Don't you dare," Martha interrupted fiercely. "Don't you dare let some coward with a spray can dictate your life or mine. You're a good worker and a good man, and I won't be bullied into making decisions based on fear." Her words were brave and generous, but Daniel could see the cost of that bravery in her eyes. She was afraid not just for her business, but for the safety of everyone associated with it. Ryan Hale arrived within minutes, looking more alert than he had in recent days. He surveyed the damage with professional detachment, taking photographs and making notes, but Daniel could see the anger simmering beneath his official demeanor. "Same person?" Martha asked. "Almost certainly," Hale replied. "Similar style, same red paint, same level of anger." He looked at Daniel meaningfully. "And an escalation in the directness of the threat." The three of them stood in uncomfortable silence, processing the implications. Someone in Millhaven hated enough to move from property damage to direct intimidation, and they were willing to target anyone who showed Daniel kindness or support. "What's our next step?" Daniel asked. Hale studied him for a moment, as if weighing options. "Our next step is to catch whoever's doing this before they decide that spray paint isn't enough." The word "our" wasn't lost on Daniel. Somewhere between their conversation in the garden and this moment, Hale had stopped seeing him as part of the problem and started seeing him as part of the solution. It was a small shift, but in the complex dynamics of small-town life, small shifts could grow into powerful changes. The question now was whether they would have enough time to build that change before the person with the spray paint decided to escalate from vandalism to something far more dangerous. As they worked together to clean the paint from the windows, Daniel found himself thinking about the choices that had brought him to this moment. Every decision since Sarah's death had been motivated by his desire to protect Lily, to give her a stable life in a safe community. But safety, he was learning, wasn't something you could simply choose. It was something you had to build, defend, and sometimes fight for. The real question wasn't whether he could find a safer place to raise his daughter. The real question was whether he was willing to stand and fight for the place they'd already begun to call home alongside people who were finally beginning to see him as an ally rather than a threat. Looking at Martha's determined expression and Hale's grim resolve, Daniel realized that for the first time since arriving in Millhaven, he wasn't facing his challenges alone. It was a small comfort in an increasingly dangerous situation, but it was enough to give him hope that maybe, just maybe, they could build something better from the ashes of fear and prejudice. The morning customers began arriving. As they finished cleaning the windows, each one pausing to stare at the faint red traces that couldn't be completely scrubbed away. Some offered words of support and outrage. Others simply hurried past, unwilling to become involved in what was clearly becoming a volatile situation. But Daniel noticed something else in their reactions, a sharpening of lines, a forced choosing of sides that suggested the town was being divided by forces beyond anyone's complete control. The person with the spray can wasn't just targeting individuals, they were forcing the entire community to confront questions about belonging, acceptance, and the kind of town they wanted to be. As the day wore on and the routine of work provided a temporary refuge from larger concerns, Daniel found himself wondering not just who was behind the vandalism, but what deeper wounds in the community it represented. Someone's pain had curdled into hatred, and that hatred was now spilling out to touch everyone around it. The challenge would be stopping the destruction before it consumed not just property, but the fragile bonds that held small communities together. In the face of escalating threats, Daniel was about to discover that sometimes the path to redemption led not away from conflict, but directly through its heart. The investigation into the vandalism took an unexpected turn 3 days later, when Hale discovered that the red paint used in both incidents had been stolen from Morrison's hardware store the same night as the first break-in. The theft had gone unnoticed because only 2 cans were missing from a large inventory, but the discovery suggested someone with intimate knowledge of the store's layout and security weaknesses. Inside job, Martha asked when Hale shared this information during his morning coffee stop. Maybe. Or someone who's been planning this for a while, someone who's been watching learning routines. Hale's voice carried a weight that suggested he understood the implications. In a town the size of Millhaven, the number of people with that kind of access was limited. Daniel listened from the kitchen, his hands moving automatically through the familiar motions of food preparation, while his mind processed what he was hearing. The vandalism wasn't random teenage mischief or the work of a passing stranger. Someone local, someone trusted enough to move freely through the business district, was systematically targeting what they perceived as threats to their vision of the community. "Any luck with the hardware store's security cameras?" Martha continued. "Morrison's system went down for maintenance the week before the break-in. Convenient timing." Hale's tone suggested he found the timing anything but convenient. Through the service window, Daniel watched Hale's face as he spoke. The officer looked better than he had in weeks, more alert, more focused, as if having a concrete problem to solve had given him something to anchor himself to. It was a reminder that beneath the hostility and the drinking, Hale was still a cop, still someone who believed in protecting his community. The morning rush proceeded normally until Mrs. Patterson entered, her usual composed demeanor cracked by obvious distress. She approached Martha at the counter with quick, nervous steps. "Martha, I need to speak with you, and with Daniel if he's available." Daniel emerged from the kitchen, noting the way Mrs. Patterson's eyes darted around the dining room as if checking to see who might be listening. Whatever had brought her here was serious enough to make the usually unflappable teacher visibly anxious. "What's wrong?" Martha asked gently. "It's about Lily," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice low but urgent. "There was an incident at school yesterday that I need to discuss with her father." Daniel felt his stomach drop. "Is she hurt? What happened?" "She's not physically hurt, but—" Mrs. Patterson glanced around again, then continued, "Perhaps we could speak privately." Martha gestured toward the small office behind the kitchen. "Use my office. I'll keep an eye on things out here." Once the door was closed, Mrs. Patterson turned to Daniel with an expression that mixed concern with determination. "Daniel, yesterday during lunch recess, 3 older boys, 5th graders, cornered Lily near the playground equipment. They were asking her questions about you, about why you came to town, whether it was true that you'd been in prison." Daniel felt anger and shame war in his chest. He'd known this moment would come eventually, but he'd hoped to have more time before Lily had to face the consequences of his past. "How did she handle it?" "Better than most adults would have," Mrs. Patterson said with evident pride. "She told them that her daddy was a good man who worked hard to take care of her, and that what happened before she was born wasn't their business. When they kept pressing, she walked away and found a teacher." "But that's not the end of it," Daniel said, reading the continued worry in her expression. "No, it's not. The boys followed her home after school. They didn't do anything threatening, but they were clearly watching your apartment building, making notes about your routine. When I heard about it from another student, I drove by and saw them myself." Daniel's protective instincts flared to life. The idea of children stalking his daughter, of turning her into a target because of his mistakes, made him want to find those boys and make it clear that Lily was off limits. But he also knew that any aggressive response from him would only confirm whatever suspicions were driving their behavior. "Do you know who these boys are?" "Tommy Morrison, Jake Henderson, and Billy Kowalski. All from what you'd call established families in town." Daniel recognized the names: Morrison from the hardware store, Henderson from the farming family, Kowalski from the auto repair shop. These weren't random bullies, but children from families with deep roots in the community, families who likely shared their parents' concerns about outsiders. "What do you recommend I do?" Mrs. Patterson leaned forward, her teacher's instincts taking over. "Talk to Lily first. Make sure she understands that none of this is her fault and that you're proud of how she handled herself. Then I think you need to speak with the boys' parents. Not confrontationally, but as one parent to others, expressing your concerns about your daughter being followed. And if that doesn't work, then we escalate to official channels. But I think you might be surprised by how reasonable people can be when you approach them directly and respectfully." Daniel nodded, though he wasn't entirely convinced. The vandalism at Mrs. Chen's shop and the diner suggested that reasonableness was in short supply among some members of the community. As they prepared to leave the office, Mrs. Patterson placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Daniel, I want you to know that not everyone in town feels the way these families do. There are plenty of people who judge you by your actions as a father and an employee, not by whatever happened in your past." Her words were kind, but they also highlighted the central challenge Daniel faced. The people who supported him tended to do so quietly, privately, while those who opposed him were becoming increasingly vocal and active. In the court of public opinion, passionate opposition often carried more weight than quiet support. When Daniel picked up Lily from school that afternoon, he could see the stress in her posture, the way she carried herself with a new awareness of being watched and judged. She was still his bright, resilient daughter, but something had shifted in her understanding of the world. "Mrs. Patterson told me some boys were bothering you yesterday," Daniel said, as they walked home. "They weren't really bothering me," Lily replied, but her voice lacked its usual confidence. They were just asking questions. What kind of questions? Lily was quiet for a moment, clearly wrestling with how much to share. They wanted to know if it was true that you hurt someone before I was born. They said their parents told them you were dangerous. The words hit Daniel like physical blows. Hearing his past reduced to such simple, damning terms through the mouth of his daughter made the shame feel fresh and overwhelming. What did you tell them? I told them that you're my daddy, and you love me, and take care of me, and that's all that matters to me. Lily's voice grew stronger as she spoke. I told them that people can change, and that even if you made mistakes before, you're not the same person now. Daniel stopped walking and knelt down to his daughter's level, overwhelmed by her loyalty and wisdom. Lily, I am so proud of you. You handled that exactly right. But Daddy, she said, her voice small again, why do some people want to believe bad things about you instead of good things? Why don't they care that you make me breakfast and help with my homework and read me stories? It was the kind of question that cut to the heart of human nature, the kind that adults spent lifetimes trying to answer. How do you explain to a 9-year-old that fear often speaks louder than evidence, that some people need someone to blame for their own unhappiness? Some people are afraid, Daniel said finally. When they're afraid, they look for simple explanations for complicated problems. It's easier to believe that outsiders are dangerous than to admit that danger can come from anywhere, even from people they've known their whole lives. Are you afraid, Daddy? Daniel considered lying, offering her the comfort of believing her father was invincible. But Lily had already seen too much of the world's complexity to be satisfied with simple reassurances. Yes, baby, I am afraid. I'm afraid that people will judge you because of my mistakes. I'm afraid that we'll have to leave Millhaven before you've had a chance to really make it your home. But I'm not afraid of standing up for what's right, and I'm not afraid of protecting you. That evening, Daniel made 3 phone calls. The first was to Tom Morrison at the hardware store. The conversation was awkward but civil, with Morrison expressing surprise that his son had been following Lily and promising to speak with the boy about appropriate behavior. The second call to Jim Henderson was more difficult. The farmer was defensive from the moment he heard Daniel's voice insisting that boys would be boys, and that maybe Daniel should be more concerned about the example he was setting than about normal childhood curiosity. The third call to Mike Kowalski at the auto shop never connected. The phone rang until an answering machine picked up, and Daniel decided not to leave a message. 2 of the 3 conversations had gone better than expected, but Daniel knew that the real test would be whether the boy's behavior actually changed. In small towns, children often reflected their parents' attitudes more accurately than their parents cared to admit. The answer came the following afternoon when Daniel arrived at the school to pick up Lily and found her in animated conversation with a group of her classmates. As he approached, he could see that she was defending him again, but this time the dynamics seemed different. My dad says your dad used to protect important people, one of the children was saying, like bodyguards in the movies. That's right, Lily replied proudly. He kept bad people from hurting good people. It was a really important job. Daniel felt a surge of gratitude toward Tom Morrison. Whatever conversation he'd had with his son had apparently included some context about Daniel's former profession, painting him as a protector rather than a threat. But why does he wash dishes now? Another child asked. Because after my mom died, we needed a fresh start, Lily explained with the matter-of-fact acceptance that children brought to life's complexities. And because helping Martha at the diner is honest work, and honest work is important. As they walked home, Daniel reflected on how much had changed in just a few days. The vandalism and harassment continued to be serious concerns, but the playground dynamics suggested that not everyone in the community was committed to seeing him as a threat. This fragile progress was tested that same evening when Daniel answered a knock at their apartment door to find Ryan Hale standing in the hallway still in uniform, but with an expression that suggested this wasn't an official visit. "We need to talk," Hale said without preamble. Daniel invited him in, noting how Hale's eyes took in the small apartment, the second-hand furniture arranged with care, Lily's artwork displayed on the refrigerator, the overall impression of a family making the best of modest circumstances. "Where's Lily?" Hale asked. "Homework in her room." "Is this something she should hear?" "No." Hale's expression was grim. "I got some information today about our vandalism problem. It's not what I expected, and it's not good news." Daniel felt his defenses rise. "What kind of information?" "The kind that suggests this isn't just about you, and it isn't going to stop with spray paint." Hale moved to the window, looking out at the quiet street below. "I've been digging into who might have access to Morrison's hardware store, who knew about Mrs. Chen's security habits, who had the knowledge and opportunity to coordinate these attacks. And I keep coming back to the same name, someone with keys to most of the businesses on Main Street, someone who knows everyone's routines, someone with a history of making moral judgments about other people's behavior." Daniel waited, sensing that Hale was struggling with whatever he was about to reveal. "It's my partner," Hale said finally. "Officer Rick Jennings. I think Rick is behind the vandalism." The revelation hit Daniel like a physical blow. He'd been preparing for the possibility that their tormentor was a disgruntled citizen or a group of local troublemakers. The idea that it was a police officer, someone sworn to protect the community, was both shocking and terrifying. "Are you sure? Sure enough to be here talking to you instead of filing an official report?" Hale turned from the window, his face heavy with the weight of betrayal. "Rick's been vocal about his feelings regarding your presence in town. He's made comments about people like you and Mrs. Chen not belonging here, about the importance of maintaining community standards." "Comments to who?" "To me, mostly. I thought it was just talk, the kind of thing cops sometimes say when they're frustrated with the job. But looking back, he was always very interested in your schedule, your routines, your relationship with Martha and the other business owners." Daniel sank into his chair, trying to process the implications. "What does this mean? What happens now?" "Now I have to decide whether to move forward with my suspicions or wait until I have more concrete evidence." Hale's voice carried the weight of professional and personal conflict. "Rick's been my partner for 3 years. We've watched each other's backs, trusted each other with our lives. Accusing him of this kind of behavior will end his career and probably destroy our friendship. But if you're right, and you don't act, the violence could escalate." "Exactly." Hale sat down heavily on Daniel's couch. "That's why I'm here. I need to know if you've noticed anything specific about Rick's behavior, any interactions that might support my suspicions." Daniel thought back over the past months, trying to recall encounters with Officer Jennings. The man was younger than Hale, maybe late 20s, with the kind of aggressive confidence that some people mistook for strength. He'd always been coldly professional in their interactions, never openly hostile like Hale had been, but never warm either. He was at the diner the morning after Mrs. Chen's shop was vandalized, Daniel remembered. He seemed very interested in the details of the damage, asked a lot of questions about who might have had access to the building. What kind of questions? Whether Mrs. Chen had given keys to anyone, whether there were other ways into the building, whether she'd had any disputes with customers recently. At the time, I thought he was just being thorough. Hale nodded grimly. Rick's good at his job when he wants to be. He'd know how to conduct an investigation that looked legitimate while actually gathering intelligence for future attacks. The conversation was interrupted by Lily emerging from her room. Her homework completed, and her attention focused on their unexpected guest. "Hi, Officer Hale," she said with her usual direct friendliness. "Are you here for dinner? Daddy makes really good spaghetti." Hale's expression softened as it always did when he interacted with Lily. "No, sweetheart. I'm just discussing some police business with your dad. But thank you for the invitation." Police business about the person who's been painting mean things on buildings. Daniel and Hale exchanged glances. They'd tried to shield Lily from the details of the vandalism, but in a town as small as Millhaven, it was impossible to keep such events completely secret. "Yes," Hale said gently. "We're trying to figure out who's been doing that so we can make sure it doesn't happen again." "Good," Lily said firmly. Mrs. Chen was really sad about her flowers, and Martha was scared about her diner. People shouldn't make other people feel sad and scared. "You're absolutely right," Hale agreed. "They shouldn't." After Lily returned to her room, Hale and Daniel continued their conversation in hushed tones. The reality of the situation was becoming clearer. If Jennings was indeed responsible for the vandalism, he had access to police resources, inside information about the investigation, and the authority to operate without suspicion. "What do you need from me?" Daniel asked. "I need you to be extra careful. If Rick realizes I'm suspicious, he might decide to escalate his tactics before I can gather enough evidence to stop him." Hale's voice was heavy with concern. "And I need you to trust me even though I know I haven't given you much reason to do that over the past months." "Why should I trust you now?" It was a fair question, and Hale took time to consider his answer. "Because we both have something to lose if this situation gets worse. You have Lily to protect, and I have a town that I swore to serve and protect. Rick's actions are threatening both of those things. And because you've realized that I'm not actually the threat you thought I was." Hale met Daniel's eyes directly. "Because I've realized that the real threat to this community isn't people trying to rebuild their lives. It's people who think they have the right to decide who belongs and who doesn't. People who use fear and violence to enforce their vision of purity." It was as close to an apology as Daniel was likely to get, and it carried more weight because it was wrapped in recognition rather than sentiment. "What's our next step?" "I'm going to start documenting Rick's behavior more carefully, looking for patterns that might connect him to the vandalism. In the meantime, I want you to vary your routines, be aware of your surroundings, and let me know immediately if anything feels off." As Hale prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "Daniel, there's something else you should know. The graffiti at the diner, 'Criminals Not Welcome,' that wasn't random wording. Rick's used that exact phrase in conversations with me about people with criminal records. It's not evidence, but it's another piece of the puzzle." After Hale left, Daniel sat in his small living room, trying to process everything he'd learned. The enemy he'd been preparing to face, an anonymous bigot operating from the shadows, had been replaced by something much more dangerous. A police officer with institutional power and intimate knowledge of both the law and how to circumvent it. The situation called for a different kind of strategy, one that balanced the need for vigilance with the requirement to maintain normalcy for Lily's sake. She was already dealing with enough stress from the playground confrontations and the general tension in town. Adding paranoia about corrupt cops to her burden seemed cruel and counterproductive. But as Daniel checked the locks on their doors and windows that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that they had entered a new and more dangerous phase of their struggle for acceptance in Millhaven. The vandalism had been alarming, but relatively minor. What came next, now that they knew they were dealing with someone who had both official authority and personal grudges, could be much worse. The following days passed with the kind of heightened awareness that comes from knowing you're being watched by hostile. Daniel found himself noting details he'd previously ignored: which cars were parked on their street, which neighbors seemed to be paying unusual attention to their apartment building, which routes offered the most visibility and safety when walking to and from work. At the diner, the atmosphere had shifted subtly but significantly. Regular customers who had previously ignored Daniel now nodded acknowledgement when they saw him. The morning after Hale's revelation, old Pete had actually complimented him on the coffee, and Mrs. Henderson had asked about Lily's progress in school. It was as if the community was slowly polarizing, with people choosing sides, based not just on their feelings about Daniel specifically, but on their broader values about justice, redemption, and what it meant to belong to a place. The change was most evident in Martha's behavior. She'd always been protective of Daniel, but now she was actively advocating for him, steering conversations away from his past and toward his present contributions to the diner and the community. "That man works harder than any two people I know," she told a customer who'd made a snide comment about hiring practices. "He's never missed a shift, never complained about the work, and he's raising one of the most polite, well-behaved children I've ever met. If that's not the kind of person we want in our community, then I don't understand what we're looking for." Daniel overheard the exchange from the kitchen and felt a surge of gratitude mixed with concern. Martha's support meant everything to him, but it also made her a target for anyone who saw his presence as a threat to the community's character. That concern proved prophetic when Daniel arrived at work Thursday morning to find Martha standing outside the diner, with tears in her eyes, staring at 4 flat tires on her car. "When did this happen?" Daniel asked, kneeling to examine the damage. "Sometime during the night. I parked here after closing, like I always do." Martha's voice shook with anger and fear. 27 years I've been running this place, never had a single problem. Now suddenly I'm a target, because I treat people with basic human decency." Daniel examined the tires more closely. They'd been slashed with something sharp and narrow, probably a knife or an awl. The cuts were precise and deliberate, the work of someone who wanted to cause maximum inconvenience without creating enough damage to constitute a serious crime. "Have you called the police?" "Already did. Ryan's on his way." Martha wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Daniel, I'm scared. Not just for me, but for you and Lily. Whoever's doing this is getting bolder, more personal." Before Daniel could respond, Hale's patrol car pulled up to the curb. The officer emerged with the grim expression of a man who'd been expecting bad news and wasn't surprised to receive it. "Same person?" Martha asked. "Almost certainly," Hale replied, photographing the damage from multiple angles. "This fits the pattern targeted harassment designed to isolate Daniel by intimidating anyone who supports him." Daniel watched Hale work, noting the thoroughness of his investigation and the professional way he documented everything. If the officer was right about his partner being responsible for the attacks, Hale was building a case with meticulous care. "Any witnesses?" Hale asked. "None that I know of. This section of Main Street is pretty quiet after 10 o'clock. Martha looked around at the other businesses, most of which wouldn't open for several hours. "Though I suppose someone could have seen something from the apartments above the stores." "I'll canvass the area," Hale said. "Martha, I know this is frustrating, but I want you to know that we're taking this seriously. This isn't just random vandalism anymore. It's a systematic campaign of harassment, and we're going to stop it." As Hale continued his investigation, Daniel found himself studying the officer's partner, who had arrived as backup. Rick Jennings was conducting his own examination of the scene, asking questions and taking notes with the same professional demeanor Hale displayed. But knowing what he now knew, Daniel found himself looking for tells signs of guilt or satisfaction that might confirm their suspicions. Jennings was younger than Hale, with the kind of military bearing that suggested either actual service or a desire to project strength and authority. His questions were thorough and professional, but Daniel noticed that he seemed particularly interested in the timing of the vandalism and whether there had been any witnesses. "Mr. Cross," Jennings said, approaching with his notebook open, "I understand you've been the target of previous harassment. Have you noticed anyone following you, watching your routines, showing unusual interest in your activities?" The question was exactly what a good investigator would ask, but it also sounded like someone gathering intelligence for future attacks. Daniel chose his words carefully. "Nothing specific," he replied. "But in a town this size, it's hard to move around without people noticing your business." Jennings made a note, then looked up with what might have been sympathy or calculation. "Has your daughter mentioned anything about being followed or approached by strangers?" Daniel felt a chill at the mention of Lily. "Why do you ask?" "Just being thorough. Children sometimes notice things adults miss, and if someone's targeting your family, they might start with surveillance before moving to direct action." The words were reasonable, even considerate, but they also served to remind Daniel that his daughter was vulnerable, that the scope of potential threats extended beyond property damage to personal safety. After the officers completed their investigation and left Daniel and Martha work together to get her car to the garage and arrange for replacement tires. The process was expensive and time-consuming, exactly the kind of disruption that would make most business owners reconsider their employment decisions. "Martha," Daniel said, as they waited for the tow truck, "maybe it's time to consider whether keeping me on is worth this kind of trouble." "Don't," Martha said firmly. "Don't you dare suggest that I should fire you because some coward is trying to intimidate us. That's exactly what they want, to make the cost of treating you decently so high that people decide it's easier to just exclude you. But if it keeps escalating, then we'll deal with it when it happens. Right now, today, I need you to work your shift and treat this like the normal Thursday it should be. We don't let bullies dictate our lives or our values." Martha's fierce loyalty was both inspiring and terrifying. Daniel understood that her support was rooted in principle as much as personal affection, but he also knew that principles could be cold comfort if the harassment escalated to actual violence. The rest of the day passed quietly, but Daniel found himself hyper-aware of every customer who entered the diner, every car that slowed as it passed the front windows, every sound that seemed out of place. The hypervigilance was exhausting, but it was also familiar from his years in protection work. The difference was that in his previous career, he'd been protecting other people from external threats. Now he was trying to protect his own family from dangers that seemed to be embedded in the very community he was trying to join. That evening, as Daniel helped Lily with her homework, she looked up from her math problems with the kind of direct gaze that meant she was about to ask a difficult question. "Daddy, are we going to have to move again?" The question hit him like a punch to the chest. "Why would you ask that, baby?" "Because some of the kids at school are saying that their parents think we should leave. And because you seem worried all the time now, like you were right after Mommy died." Daniel set down the homework he'd been checking and pulled his daughter into his lap. At 9, she was getting almost too big for such gestures, but she still fit perfectly against his chest, still smelled like strawberry shampoo and childhood innocence. "I am worried," he admitted. "There are some people in town who don't want us here, and they're doing things to try to make us feel unwelcome. Like painting mean words on Martha's diner." "Yes, like that. And other things, too." Lily was quiet for a moment, processing this information with the seriousness she brought to all adult problems. "Are they going to hurt us?" It was the question Daniel had been dreading, the one that forced him to confront the possibility that his quest for redemption might be putting his daughter in actual danger. "I don't know," he said honestly. But I promise you that I'm doing everything I can to keep us safe, and there are good people helping me. Like Officer Hale. Yes, like Officer Hale, and Martha and Mrs. Patterson and other people who believe that everyone deserves a chance to start over. Lily nodded solemnly. I like it here, Daddy. I like my school and my teacher and the garden we planted. I don't want to leave. I don't want to leave either, baby. This feels like home to me too. Then we'll stay and fight for it. Daniel smiled despite his fears. His daughter had inherited Sarah's fierce determination, her refusal to back down from challenges simply because they were difficult. Yes, he said firmly. We'll stay and fight for it. As he tucked Lily into bed that night and performed their ritual monster check, Daniel found himself thinking about the nature of the fight they were facing. It wasn't the kind of physical confrontation he'd been trained for in his protection work. It was something more complex and potentially more dangerous, a battle for the soul of a community fought not with weapons, but with choices about how to treat neighbors and strangers, insiders and outsiders. The vandalism and harassment were symptoms of a deeper disease, a fear of change, that manifested as hatred for anyone who challenged the status quo simply by existing. Fighting that disease would require more than just catching the person with the spray paint. It would require changing hearts and minds, demonstrating through daily actions that diversity could strengthen rather than threaten a community's character. Looking down at his sleeping daughter, her face peaceful and trusting in the glow of her nightlight, Daniel felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like armor. She was counting on him to make this work, to build a life in Millhaven that would give her the stability and belonging she deserved. But as the sounds of the town settled into nighttime quiet around their small apartment, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that their real test was still coming, that everything they'd faced so far was just preparation for a confrontation that would determine not just their future in Millhaven, but the kind of place the town itself would choose to become. Outside, somewhere in the darkness, Rick Jennings was perhaps planning his next move, unaware that his partner had begun to suspect his involvement in the harassment campaign. The collision between those two realities, Hale's growing suspicions and Jennings's escalating tactics, was creating a pressure that would soon demand release. When that moment came, Daniel realized all the careful navigation and patient endurance in the world might not be enough. Sometimes he was beginning to understand the path to redemption led not around conflict, but directly through its most dangerous heart. The breakthrough came 2 days later when Hale discovered footage from a traffic camera positioned at the intersection near First National Bank of Millhaven. The camera's angle captured a partial view of Main Street, including the alley behind Morrison's hardware store where the paint had been stolen. At 2:17 a.m. on the night of the first vandalism, a figure matching Rick Jennings's build could be seen moving through the shadows, though the image quality was too poor for positive identification. Hale stared at the grainy footage on his computer screen, feeling the weight of betrayal settle deeper into his chest. He'd been hoping his suspicions were wrong, that his partner's increasingly bitter comments about outsiders and community standards were just talk. But the timeline matched perfectly, and Rick had been the one to suggest they focus their investigation on transients and known troublemakers rather than local suspects. The evidence was circumstantial, but compelling enough to warrant a confrontation. Hale waited until their shift ended that afternoon, then followed Rick to Murphy's bar, where his partner had developed an unfortunate habit of drinking away his frustrations with the changing world. Inside the dimly lit establishment, Rick sat alone at the far end of the bar, nursing a whiskey and staring at the television with the kind of vacant intensity that suggested his mind was elsewhere. Hale took the stool beside him and ordered a coffee black. "Rough day?" Hale asked casually. "They're all rough days lately," Rick replied without looking away from the TV. This town's going to hell, Ryan. Used to be a place where people knew their neighbors, where you could trust everyone on your street. Now we've got criminals washing dishes and foreign shop owners who don't understand American values. Hale sipped his coffee and waited. In his experience, guilty people often confessed if you gave them enough rope and enough silence. You know what the real problem is? Rick continued, his words slightly slurred from the alcohol. Nobody has the courage to stand up for what's right anymore. Everyone's so worried about being politically correct, about not offending anyone, that they let dangerous people walk among us. Dangerous how? Hale asked quietly. Cross killed someone, Ryan. Maybe it was technically legal, maybe he got off on self-defense, but he took a life. And now he's here around our families, around our children. What happens when he snaps again? What happens when little Lily gets in his way, or some customer pushes him too far? Rick's version of Daniel's past was distorted, but not entirely inaccurate. During his bodyguard career, Daniel had indeed been forced to use lethal force to protect a client from an armed attacker. The incident had been investigated thoroughly, ruled justified, and resulted in no criminal charges. But the civil lawsuit that followed had bankrupted him and effectively ended his career. So what do you think should happen? Hale pressed. I think people like that should understand they're not welcome here. I think sometimes the community has to send a message when the official channels fail to protect them. Rick finished his whiskey and signaled for another. In the mirror behind the bar, Hale could see his partner's reflection, flushed from alcohol and anger, his eyes carrying the kind of righteous fury that justified terrible actions in the minds of those who committed them. Rick, Hale said carefully, did you have anything to do with the vandalism at Mrs. Chen's shop? Or the diner? The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Rick's hand stilled on his glass, and for a moment, the only sound was the low murmur of other conversations and the baseball game playing on the television. Why would you ask me that? Rick's voice was steady, but Hale could see the tension in his shoulders. Because I know you have keys to most of the businesses on Main Street. Because you knew about the timing of Mrs. Chen's security system maintenance. Because you've been vocal about your feelings regarding Daniel Cross and what you see as the changing character of our community. Rick turned to face him for the first time since Hale had arrived. His eyes were clear now, the alcohol-induced haze replaced by sharp focus and calculation. You think I'm some kind of vigilante? Some rogue cop taking the law into my own hands? I think you're a good officer who's let personal feelings cloud his judgment about what constitutes justice. Rick laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Justice Ryan Justice would be running that bastard out of town before he hurts someone. Justice would be protecting this community from people who bring violence and chaos wherever they go. And if I told you that Daniel Cross has never shown any signs of violence or instability since arriving in Millhaven, if I told you that his biggest crime seems to be trying to rebuild his life and raise his daughter in peace, I'd say you've been spending too much time listening to Martha's bleeding heart nonsense and not enough time thinking about your duty to this community. The conversation was spiraling toward confrontation, but Hale needed Rick to admit his involvement before taking official action. Without a confession or hard physical evidence, any accusation would be dismissed as interdepartmental politics. Rick, I need you to tell me the truth. Are you behind the vandalism? For a long moment, Rick studied his partner's face, weighing options and calculating consequences. Then his expression hardened into something that looked like defiance mixed with resignation. You want the truth? Fine. Yes, I painted those messages. Yes, I broke Mrs. Chen's window and trashed her shop. Yes, I slashed Martha's tires, and you know what, I'm not sorry. Someone had to take a stand. The confession hit Hale like a physical blow. Despite his suspicions, hearing Rick admit to the crimes felt like betrayal and vindication rolled into one overwhelming moment. Why, Rick? Why throw away your career, your reputation, everything you've worked for? Because some things are more important than a career, Rick replied with bitter conviction. Because I took an oath to protect and serve this community, and sometimes that means protecting it from threats the system won't acknowledge. Daniel Cross isn't a threat. He's a man trying to start over, trying to give his daughter a stable life. He's a killer, Ryan. Maybe he hasn't killed anyone here yet, but violence follows men like that. It's only a matter of time before someone gets hurt. And when it happens, I want to be able to I tried to prevent it. Hale realized that Rick genuinely believed his own justifications, that he'd constructed an elaborate moral framework to explain actions that were fundamentally about fear and prejudice. It was a sobering reminder of how people could rationalize terrible behavior when they convinced themselves they were serving a greater good. Rick, I have to place you under arrest. I figured you might. Rick finished his second whiskey and placed the glass carefully on the bar. But before you do, you should know that this isn't over. There are other people in this town who feel the same way I do, people who won't just stand by and watch while our community is infected by dangerous outsiders. Are you threatening more violence? I'm telling you that I'm not alone in this. The vandalism was just the beginning, Ryan. If official channels won't protect this town, citizens will find other ways to make their feelings known. The implications of Rick's words sent a chill through Hale's chest. His partner wasn't just a lone actor driven by personal prejudice. He was part of a larger movement, a group of people who had decided that vigilante action was justified when legal remedies seemed inadequate. Hale made the arrest quietly, without backup or drama, walking Rick out of Murphy's bar, with the kind of professional dignity that marked the end of a partnership and possibly a friendship. As he secured his former partner in the patrol car, Hale found himself thinking about the broader implications of what he'd learned. If Rick was right about having support from other community members, then arresting him might actually escalate the situation rather than resolve it. People who felt their cause was just often became more determined when they saw their leaders punished by what they perceived as a corrupt system. The booking process was handled with minimal fanfare, but word of Rick's arrest spread through Millhaven's law enforcement and government circles within hours. By evening, rumors were circulating through the town's gossip networks, growing more elaborate and distorted with each retelling. Daniel learned about the arrest from Martha, who had heard it from her neighbor, who had gotten it from her husband, who worked dispatch at the sheriff's office. By the time the news reached the diner, the story had transformed into something much more dramatic than a simple vandalism case. They're saying Rick Jennings was running some kind of conspiracy, Martha reported as she and Daniel closed the diner that evening. That there's a whole group of people involved, that they were planning something big before Ryan stopped them. Daniel felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Relief that the vandalism might finally stop, but apprehension about what Rick's arrest might trigger among his supporters in the community. Did Ryan say anything about what happens next? Daniel asked. Just that Rick's been charged with vandalism and criminal mischief, and that the investigation is ongoing. Martha locked the register with hands that shook slightly. Daniel, I'm scared that this might make things worse instead of better. If Rick really does have supporters, they might see his arrest as persecution rather than justice. Martha's fears proved prophetic. The next morning, Daniel arrived at work to find a small but vocal group of protesters gathered outside the diner. They carried signs with messages like, "Support our police" and "Community standards matter," and their presence drew curious onlookers from across the downtown area. The protest was led by Jim Henderson, the farmer whose son had been among those harassing Lily at school. Henderson was a large man with the kind of weathered face that spoke to decades of outdoor work, and his voice carried easily across Main Street as he addressed the growing crowd. "Rick Jennings is a good man who dedicated his career to protecting this community," Henderson declared. "He's being prosecuted for trying to maintain the values that made Millhaven a safe place to raise our families. Meanwhile, the real threat to our safety walks free, protected by misguided notions of political correctness." Daniel watched the scene from inside the diner, recognizing the dangerous rhetoric that could easily escalate from protest to violence. Henderson wasn't explicitly calling for action against Daniel or his family, but his words were carefully chosen to inflame emotions and justify aggressive responses. "We need to remember what kind of town we want Millhaven to be," Henderson continued. "Do we want a place where criminals can start over with clean slates, where foreign business owners change our traditional character? Or do we want a community that honors its heritage and protects its children from those who bring violence and chaos?" The crowd's response was mixed. Some people nodded agreement and applauded Henderson's words. Others looked uncomfortable with the rhetoric, shifting nervously and glancing toward the diner where they knew Daniel was listening. Hale arrived within minutes, his patrol car moving slowly through the crowd as protesters reluctantly made way. He parked near the diner entrance and approached Henderson with the kind of professional calm that suggested he'd been expecting this development. "Jim, you have a right to peaceful protest, but I need to make sure this doesn't escalate into something that threatens public safety." "We're not threatening anyone, Ryan," Henderson replied. "We're exercising our constitutional right to express our concerns about the direction our community is heading." "I understand that, but I also need you to understand that any harassment or intimidation of local residents will result in arrests. That includes Mr. Cross, Mrs. Chen Martha, or anyone else who's become a target in this situation." Henderson's expression hardened. "So you're choosing sides now, protecting criminals over the people who elected you." "I'm protecting the law and the rights of all citizens, regardless of their background or how long they've lived here," Hale replied firmly. "That's what I swore to do when I put on this badge." The exchange between Henderson and Hale crystallized the fundamental conflict that had been building in Millhaven for months. On one side were those who saw the town as a sanctuary that needed to be protected from outside influences. On the other, there were those who believed in that true community strength came from embracing diversity and offering second chances. As the morning progressed, the protest remained peaceful but persistent. Customers entering the diner had to walk past the demonstrators, some of whom made pointed comments about supporting businesses that employed the right kind of people. The harassment was subtle but effective. Several regular customers turned away rather than navigate the gauntlet of judgment and confrontation. Inside the diner, the atmosphere was tense but determined. Martha moved through her morning routine with the kind of fierce efficiency that suggested she was channeling her anxiety into productive action. Daniel worked in the kitchen, trying to maintain normalcy, while acutely aware of the hostile voices just beyond the windows. The situation took an unexpected turn when Mrs. Patterson arrived for her usual Wednesday morning coffee, walking through the protesters with the kind of calm dignity that only experienced teachers possessed. She ordered her coffee, settled into her usual booth, and pulled out a stack of papers to grade, as if the demonstration outside was merely an inconvenience rather than an attempt at intimidation. Her presence seemed to embolden other supporters. Father McKinnon arrived next, followed by Dr. Sarah Martinez from the local clinic, then Tom Morrison from the hardware store. One by one, people who believed in giving Daniel a chance made the conscious choice to patronize the diner, despite the pressure from the protesters. The counter-demonstration was subtle but powerful. These customers didn't make speeches or carry signs, but their presence sent a clear message that the community was divided, that Rick Jennings and Jim Henderson didn't speak for everyone in Millhaven. The morning's most dramatic moment came when Mrs. Chen arrived carrying a large bouquet of flowers and walking directly through the center of the protest group. Several protesters stepped aside uncomfortably as she approached, recognizing the courage it took for a woman whose business had been vandalized to make such a public show of support. "For Martha," Mrs. Chen said simply as she presented the flowers. "And for Daniel. Thank you for showing me that not everyone in this town judges people by their differences." Martha accepted the flowers with tears in her eyes, understanding the symbolic weight of the gesture. In a community where choosing sides carried real social and economic consequences, Mrs. Chen was making her position clear regardless of the personal cost. The protest began to lose momentum around noon as participants drifted away to jobs and other responsibilities. But Henderson made sure to leave with a parting message that carried the weight of a threat. "This isn't over," he announced to the remaining crowd and anyone else within earshot. "Rick Jennings was just one man trying to protect our community. There are others who share his concerns, people who won't be intimidated by political correctness or misguided notions of tolerance." As the protesters finally dispersed, Daniel emerged from the kitchen to help Martha clean up the disruption they'd caused: coffee cups left on the sidewalk, trampled flower beds, and the general atmosphere of hostility that would take time to dissipate. "You okay?" Martha asked, noting the tension in his shoulders. "I keep thinking about what Henderson said, that this isn't over, that there are others who feel like Rick does." Daniel swept debris from the sidewalk, his movements sharp with anxiety. What if arresting Rick just made things worse? What if it convinced his supporters that they need to take more direct action? "Then we'll deal with whatever comes next," Martha replied firmly. "But we won't let fear dictate our choices. That's exactly what they want, for us to be so scared of their reaction that we give up on doing what's right." That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor to the diner. Mayor Patricia Whitman, a woman in her 50s, who had held office for nearly a decade through a combination of political pragmatism and genuine concern for her constituents, entered during the lull between lunch and dinner service. Mayor Whitman was known for her ability to navigate controversial issues without alienating major voting blocs, but the situation with Daniel and Rick Jennings was testing those skills in unprecedented ways. "Martha Daniel," she said, settling into a booth near the back of the diner. "I think it's time we had a conversation about how to move forward from this morning's events." Daniel joined Martha at the table, noting the careful way the mayor chose her words. Everything about her demeanor suggested she was walking a political tightrope, trying to address the situation without taking sides in a way that might cost her support. "Patricia, I appreciate you coming by," Martha began. "But I hope you're not here to suggest that Daniel should leave town for the sake of community peace. Actually, I'm here to discuss how we can make his staying work for everyone involved." Mayor Whitman's response was surprising in its directness. This morning's protest made it clear that our community is divided, but it also showed that Daniel has significant support from respected citizens. "What are you proposing?" Daniel asked. "A town hall meeting, a chance for everyone to express their concerns openly in a controlled environment where we can have a real conversation about community values and what it means to belong in Millhaven." Daniel felt a chill at the suggestion. The idea of facing a room full of people who might share Henderson's views of having to defend his right to exist in their community was terrifying. "Patricia," Martha said carefully, "that sounds dangerously close to putting Daniel on trial for the crime of trying to rebuild his life. I understand the concern, but consider the alternative. Right now, people are making judgments based on rumors, speculation, and fear. A town hall would give Daniel a chance to tell his story directly, to let people see him as a father and a neighbor rather than as an abstract threat. Mayor Whitman leaned forward, her expression earnest. Look, I'll be honest with both of you. Henderson and his supporters are talking about organizing more protests, possibly targeting other businesses that employ or serve people they consider undesirable. We can either address this through open dialogue, or we can let it fester until someone gets hurt. The mayor's words carried the weight of political reality. Daniel understood that she was offering him a chance to make his case to the community, but she was also warning him that the alternative might be much worse. If I agree to this town hall, Daniel said slowly, what guarantees do I have that it won't become a public lynching? What's to stop it from turning into an opportunity for people like Henderson to rally opposition against me? You have my word that the meeting will be moderated fairly with equal time for supporters and opponents to speak. You'll have the opportunity to address the audience directly, to answer questions, and to present your side of the story. Daniel looked at Martha, reading the conflict in her expression. She wanted to protect him from further public scrutiny, but she also understood the political necessities they faced. When would this happen? Daniel asked. Next Friday evening at the high school gymnasium. That gives us a week to spread the word and ensure good attendance from all parts of the community. A week to prepare for what might be the most important night of his time in Millhaven. A week to figure out how to convince a divided town that he deserved a chance to belong, that his past mistakes didn't disqualify him from being a neighbor, a father, a contributing member of the community. After Mayor Whitman left, Daniel sat alone in the empty diner weighing his options. He could refuse the town hall and hope that the situation would eventually calm down, but Henderson's words about escalation suggested that inaction might lead to worse consequences. He could agree to the meeting and risk public humiliation, or worse, but at least have a chance to make his case directly. The decision was made easier by a phone call that evening from Mrs. Patterson. Lily's teacher had heard about the proposed town hall and wanted to offer her perspective on what it might mean for his daughter. Daniel, I think you should do it, she said without preamble. Not because it's safe or comfortable, but because it's an opportunity to change the narrative that's been building around you and Lily. What if it backfires? What if it just gives Henderson and his supporters a bigger platform to demand that we leave? That's a risk, Mrs. Patterson acknowledged. But consider this, right now Lily is dealing with whispered rumors and playground confrontations based on partial information and deliberate distortions. A town hall would give you a chance to tell the whole truth, to let people understand the real person behind the sensationalized stories. That night, as Daniel tucked Lily into bed, she asked about the protesters who had gathered outside the diner. Some people were angry today, weren't they, Daddy? Yes, baby, they were. Some people think I don't belong in Millhaven, that my past mistakes mean I shouldn't be allowed to start over here. But you do belong here, Lily said, with the fierce certainty that only children possessed. You work hard and you're nice to people and you make really good pancakes. That's what belonging means, isn't it? Daniel smiled, despite his fears. In his daughter's simple logic, belonging was about actions rather than history, about character rather than reputation. Mayor Whitman wants to have a big meeting where people can ask me questions and I can tell them about who we really are, Daniel said carefully. Would you be okay with that? With me talking to a lot of people about our family? Lily considered this seriously. Will you tell them about how you check for monsters under my bed and how you help me with my homework, even when you're tired from work? I'll tell them about all the important things, Daniel promised. About how much I love you and how hard I'm trying to be the kind of father you deserve. Then I think you should do it, Lily said. Maybe if they understand who you really are, they'll stop being scared of you. The following week passed in a blur of preparation and anxiety. Daniel worked with Martha and Father McKinnon to craft a presentation that would honestly address his past, while emphasizing his commitment to redemption and community contribution. He practiced answering hostile questions, prepared for accusations and challenges, and tried to build the mental armor he'd need to face a room full of people who might see him as a threat to everything they valued. Hale stopped by the diner several times during the week, ostensibly for coffee, but actually to check on Daniel's state of mind and to share updates about the investigation. Rick Jennings had been released on bail but suspended from duty pending trial. His supporters were using his legal troubles to rally opposition to what they saw as politically correct persecution of law enforcement. "How are you feeling about Friday night?" Hale asked during one of these visits. "Terrified," Daniel admitted, "but also ready to finally have this conversation out in the open instead of through whispers and vandalism." "Whatever happens, you won't be alone up there. Martha's planning to speak on your behalf, and Mrs. Patterson has prepared a statement about Lily's progress in school. Father McKinnon wants to address the Christian aspects of redemption and second chances." The support was gratifying, but also daunting. Daniel understood that these people were risking their own standing in the community to defend him, and he felt the weight of responsibility to justify their faith. The night before the town hall, Daniel sat in his small apartment, reading over his prepared remarks one final time. The words felt inadequate to capture the complexity of his journey, from bodyguard to dishwasher, from convicted felon to devoted father, from stranger to would-be neighbor, but inadequate. Or not, they were the truth. As he understood it, a story of mistakes and consequences, loss and hope, the daily struggle to become worthy of his daughter's love and his community's acceptance. Tomorrow night would determine whether that truth was enough to overcome fear, prejudice, and the human tendency to reject what seemed different or threatening. Tomorrow night would test whether redemption was possible in a small town where everyone knew your business and past mistakes never seemed to fade. As Daniel finally turned out the lights and tried to sleep, he found himself thinking not just about his own future, but about the kind of community Millhaven would choose to become. The town hall wasn't just about whether Daniel Cross deserved a second chance. It was about whether the people of Millhaven believed in the possibility of change growth and the radical idea that everyone deserved the opportunity to become better than their worst moment. The answer to that question would echo far beyond Daniel's individual situation, shaping the community's character for years to come. In 12 hours, a high school gymnasium would become the arena where those fundamental values would be tested, defended, and ultimately chosen. The gymnasium at Millhaven High School, filled with an electricity that had nothing to do with the fluorescent lights humming overhead. By 7 o'clock Friday evening, nearly 300 people had gathered in the bleachers, their conversations creating a low rumble of anticipation and tension that seemed to vibrate through the polished wooden floors. Daniel sat in the front row, his hands folded carefully in his lap to hide their trembling. Beside him, Lily fidgeted with the hem of her best dress, the blue one with small white flowers that Sarah had bought for her 8th birthday. Martha sat on his other side, her presence solid and reassuring, while Father McKinnon occupied the chair beyond her, his weathered hands clasped in what might have been prayer. The crowd was roughly divided, though not in any neat geographical pattern. Henderson's supporters clustered in one section of the bleachers, their expressions ranging from stern disapproval to outright hostility. But scattered throughout the gymnasium were faces Daniel had come to recognize as friendly Mrs. Patterson, with a group of teachers, Dr. Martinez from the clinic, Tom Morrison, looking uncomfortable but determined, and dozens of others who had chosen to hear him out, rather than judge him in absentia. Mayor Whitman approached the microphone that had been set up near center court, her political instincts clearly working overtime as she surveyed the divided crowd. She wore a navy blue suit that projected authority while remaining approachable, and her voice carried easily through the sound system when she began to speak. Thank you all for coming tonight. This town hall represents democracy at its most fundamental level, neighbors gathering to discuss issues that affect our community's future. She paused, her gaze sweeping across the assembled faces. Tonight, we're here to talk about belonging, about second chances, and about what kind of town we want Millhaven to be. A murmur ran through the crowd at her words. Some people nodded approval, while others shifted restlessly in their seats. Before we begin, I want to establish some ground rules. Everyone will have a chance to speak, but we will maintain civility and respect. This is not a trial and it's not a witch hunt. This is a conversation about our community's values. Henderson raised his hand from his seat in the bleachers. Patricia, with all due respect, some conversations need to be had whether they're comfortable or not. This man brought violence and chaos into our town, and pretending otherwise isn't going to protect our families. Jim, you'll have your chance to express your concerns, but first I think we should hear from Daniel Cross himself. Give him the opportunity to tell his story in his own words. Daniel felt every eye in the gymnasium turn toward him as he stood and walked to the microphone. The distance felt infinite, each step echoing in the sudden silence. When he reached the center of the court, he looked out at the sea of faces, some curious, some hostile, some hopeful, and felt the weight of everything that had brought him to this moment. Thank you, Mayor Whitman. Thank you all for being here tonight. His voice carried clearly through the sound system, steadier than he'd expected. My name is Daniel Cross, and 8 months ago, I came to Millhaven with my 9-year-old daughter, looking for a chance to start over. He paused, gathering his thoughts and his courage. Lily sat in the front row, her small face turned up toward him, with complete trust and confidence, and her belief in him gave him strength. I know that many of you have heard stories about my past, and I'm not here tonight to deny them or make excuses. Yes, I was convicted of assault. Yes, I served 18 months in prison. Yes, I made mistakes that had serious consequences for my family and for innocent people who got caught in the crossfire. The gymnasium remained silent, but Daniel could feel the attention of everyone present focused on his words with laser intensity. But I'm not here to talk about who I was. I'm here to talk about who I'm trying to become, and to ask for your help in that process. He told them about Sarah's death, about the financial collapse that followed his conviction, about the desperate search for a place where Lily could grow up safely while he rebuilt their lives. He spoke about the dignity of work, about finding purpose in washing dishes and making coffee, about the satisfaction of earning an honest living, even when that living was humble. Some of you might wonder why I chose Millhaven, why I didn't go to a big city where I could disappear into anonymity. The answer is simple. I wanted my daughter to grow up in a place where neighbors know each other, where children can walk to school safely, where community still means something. Daniel's voice grew stronger as he continued. I wanted her to understand that home isn't just a building you live in. It's a place where people care about each other, where everyone has a role to play, where your worth is measured by your contributions rather than your worst moments. From the bleachers, Henderson's voice cut through the silence. That's a nice speech, Cross, but words don't change the fact that you're a violent man who brings danger wherever he goes. Daniel turned toward Henderson, his expression calm but resolute. Mr. Henderson, I understand your concerns, and I respect your right to express them. But I'd like to ask you something. What have I actually done since arriving in Millhaven that suggests I'm a danger to this community? Henderson stood, his large frame imposing even from the bleachers. You don't have to do anything yet. Violence follows men like you. It's only a matter of time before someone pushes you too far, before you snap and hurt someone. In 8 months, I've been harassed, vandalized, and publicly humiliated, Daniel replied steadily. My daughter has been followed by older children. My employer has been targeted for giving me a job, and I've had to explain to a 9-year-old why some people think her father is a monster. If I was going to snap, as you put it, wouldn't it have happened by now? The question hung in the air, and Daniel could see some people in the crowd considering it seriously. Henderson's argument relied on the assumption that violence was inevitable, but Daniel's restraint in the face of sustained provocation suggested otherwise. Mrs. Patterson stood from her seat. "May I speak, Mayor Whitman?" "Of course, Jane." Mrs. Patterson moved to the microphone with the confidence of someone accustomed to addressing groups. "I've been teaching in this district for 22 years, and in that time I've seen hundreds of children come through my classroom. Some come from stable homes with 2 loving parents. Some come from situations of poverty, divorce, abuse, or neglect. I can usually tell within the first week which children feel secure and loved, and which ones are struggling." She paused, her gaze finding Lily in the front row. Lily Cross is one of the most well-adjusted, confident, and kind children I've ever taught. She stands up for classmates who are being bullied. She helps younger children who are struggling. She approaches every challenge with curiosity rather than fear. These aren't the behaviors of a child who lives in an atmosphere of violence or instability. Mrs. Patterson turned to address the crowd directly. Children are mirrors reflecting the emotional environment of their homes. Lily's behavior tells me everything I need to know about the kind of father Daniel Cross is, regardless of what he might have done in the past. Her words carried weight with the parents in the audience, many of whom knew and respected her professional judgment. Daniel saw several faces in the crowd soften as they considered what she was saying. Martha rose next, approaching the microphone with the no-nonsense determination that had made her a successful business owner for nearly 3 decades. "I've employed Daniel Cross for 8 months, she said simply. "He's never missed a shift, never complained about the work, never shown anything but respect for customers and coworkers. He arrives early, stays late when needed, and takes pride in doing even the humblest tasks well." She looked directly at Henderson. "Jim, you talk about community values, about the kind of people we want in our town. Well, I want people who work hard, who pay their bills, who treat others with kindness and respect. I want people who understand that your worth isn't determined by your bank account or your family name, but by how you treat your neighbors and raise your children." Martha's voice grew stronger. "Daniel Cross embodies those values better than some people who've lived here their entire lives." The testimonials continued. Martinez spoke about Daniel's careful attention to Lily's health and well-being during routine medical visits. Tom Morrison shared his surprise at discovering that Daniel had quietly paid for paint to repair the damage at Mrs. Chen's flower shop, despite having no obligation to do so. But it was Father McKinnon who provided the most compelling perspective on Daniel's situation. "In my 40 years of ministry, I've learned that redemption isn't a single moment of transformation. It's a daily choice, a commitment to becoming better than you were yesterday." The elderly priest's voice carried the authority of decades spent counseling people through their darkest moments. "I've watched Daniel Cross make that choice every day for 8 months. I've seen him swallow his pride when faced with unfair treatment. I've seen him put his daughter's needs before his own comfort. I've seen him contribute to this community even when that community has been reluctant to accept his contributions." Father McKinnon paused, his weathered hands gripping the sides of the podium. "The question before us tonight isn't whether Daniel Cross deserves our forgiveness. That's between him and God. The question is whether we as a community have the wisdom and courage to recognize genuine change when we see it." As the testimonials concluded, Mayor Whitman opened the floor for questions from the audience. The inquiries ranged from practical concerns about background checks and community safety to more philosophical questions about justice, redemption, and the nature of belonging. Daniel answered each question honestly, acknowledging the legitimate concerns while providing context for his past actions and evidence of his current commitment to peaceful, lawful behavior. He spoke about the bodyguard career that had ended in legal complications, about the financial devastation that followed his conviction, about the daily struggle to rebuild trust and credibility. But it was when a young mother asked about his relationship with Lily that Daniel's composure finally cracked. "Mr. Cross, as a parent, I need to understand, how do I explain to my children why they should trust someone who has used violence in the past?" Daniel's voice caught as he considered the question. "Ma'am, that's the hardest part of this whole situation. My daughter shouldn't have to pay the price for my mistakes, but she does. Every day she faces questions and suspicions that exist because of choices I made before she was even born." He looked directly at Lily, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "The only answer I can give you is this: watch how she turns out. Watch whether she grows up to be kind, confident, and secure. Watch whether she treats others with respect and empathy. Because if I'm the kind of father who could raise that kind of child, then maybe I'm not the monster some people think I am." The gymnasium fell silent as Daniel's words settled over the crowd. In that moment, many people saw him not as an abstract threat or a symbol of societal problems, but as a father desperately trying to build a better life for his daughter. The silence was broken by an unexpected voice, Rick Jennings, who had entered the gymnasium quietly during the testimonials and now stood at the back of the crowd. "May I speak?" Rick's voice carried across the silent room. Mayor Whitman looked surprised but nodded. "Of course, though I should note that you're currently facing charges related to the vandalism that brought us here tonight." Rick walked slowly down the center aisle, his civilian clothes and haggard appearance a stark contrast to the confident officer he'd been just weeks earlier. When he reached the microphone, he stood for a moment without speaking, as if gathering courage for what he was about to say. "8 months ago, when Daniel Cross came to Millhaven, I saw him as a threat to everything I valued about this community. I saw a violent criminal who was trying to hide his true nature behind a facade of respectability." Rick's voice was steady but heavy with emotion. "I was so convinced that he was dangerous that I took it upon myself to drive him away through intimidation and harassment. I vandalized businesses that employed or served him. I tried to turn the community against him through fear and suspicion." The crowd stirred restlessly, some people clearly uncomfortable with Rick's public confession. But tonight, listening to the testimony about Daniel's character and behavior, I have to confront a painful truth: I was wrong. Not just wrong about Daniel specifically, but wrong about what constitutes a threat to our community. Rick turned to look directly at Daniel, his face heavy with shame and recognition. The real threat wasn't a man trying to rebuild his life and raise his daughter with dignity. The real threat was a police officer who let fear and prejudice override his professional judgment, who used his badge to persecute someone who posed no actual danger to anyone. The gymnasium remained silent as Rick continued his public reckoning. Daniel Cross never hurt anyone in this town. He never threatened anyone, never caused any trouble beyond the crime of existing while having an imperfect past. But I did hurt people. I hurt Mrs. Chen, I hurt Martha. I hurt this entire community by poisoning it with suspicion and division. Rick's voice cracked slightly. If we're going to judge people by their actions rather than their reputations, then Daniel Cross has proven himself to be a good neighbor and a devoted father. And I've proven myself to be the kind of person this community should actually fear, someone who uses power to hurt innocent people because of personal prejudices. The confession was devastating in its honesty and its implications. Rick Jennings, the man who had positioned himself as a defender of community values, was publicly admitting that he had become the very threat he claimed to be fighting against. As Rick returned to his seat, the gymnasium buzzed with whispered conversations. People were reassessing everything they thought they knew about the situation, reconsidering their positions in light of this dramatic revelation. Mayor Whitman returned to the microphone, her expression reflecting the weight of what had just occurred. "I think we've heard enough testimony for one evening. Before we conclude, I'd like to give Daniel one more opportunity to address the community." Daniel approached the microphone for the final time, his mind racing as he tried to find words adequate to the moment. He looked out at the crowd, some faces still hostile, others thoughtful, many clearly moved by what they'd heard. "8 months ago, I came to Millhaven as a stranger, asking for a chance. Tonight I leave as someone who has been truly heard by his neighbors, even if we don't all agree on what that means." He paused, his voice steady but emotional. "To those of you who have supported my family and me, who have judged us by our actions rather than our history, thank you. Your kindness has made it possible for us to build a life here, and your faith in us has been a gift beyond measure." Daniel's gaze found Henderson in the bleachers. "To those of you who remain concerned about our presence here, I respect your right to those feelings. All I can ask is that you continue to watch, to judge us by what we do rather than what we've done, and to remember that everyone deserves the chance to become better than their worst moment." He looked directly at Rick Jennings. "And to Officer Jennings, I want you to know that I forgive you. What you did was wrong, but it came from a place of genuine concern for your community. That concern was misguided, but it wasn't malicious. We've all made mistakes that seemed justified at the time." Finally, Daniel turned to his daughter sitting in the front row with tears streaming down her face. "Lily, everything I've done, every choice I've made since your mother died, has been about trying to become the father you deserve. Thank you for believing in me even when I wasn't sure I deserved that belief." As Daniel stepped away from the microphone, the gymnasium erupted in applause that was neither universal nor entirely enthusiastic, but was genuine and sustained. People were clapping not just for his words, but for his courage in facing the community's judgment, for his honesty about his failures, and his commitment to redemption. The town hall officially concluded with Mayor Whitman's closing remarks about the importance of civic engagement and community dialogue. But the real business of the evening continued in the parking lot and on the sidewalks as people lingered to process what they'd experienced. Daniel found himself surrounded by well-wishers and supporters, people who wanted to shake his hand or offer words of encouragement. But he also noticed others who left quickly, their expressions suggesting they remained unconvinced despite everything they'd heard. The division in the community hadn't been healed by a single evening of testimony, but something fundamental had shifted. The conversation had moved from whispered suspicions and anonymous harassment to open dialogue and public accountability. The hidden had been exposed, the assumptions challenged, the human cost of prejudice made visible. 3 weeks later, Daniel was working the morning shift at the diner when the bell above the front door chimed, announcing the arrival of a customer who made his hands freeze on the coffee pot he was filling. Ryan Hale entered, but he wasn't alone. Walking beside him was a young boy, maybe 7 years old, with the officer's pale blue eyes and the cautious demeanor of a child who had seen too much disruption in his short life. "Morning, Martha," Hale said, his voice carrying a warmth that had been absent during the difficult months of investigation and accusation. "I'd like you to meet my son, Jake. Jake, this is Martha, who owns the diner, and this is Daniel, who makes the best pancakes in town." The introduction was casual, but Daniel understood its significance immediately. Hale wasn't just bringing his son for breakfast. He was making a public statement about trust and acceptance, demonstrating his belief that Daniel posed no threat to children. "Nice to meet you, Jake," Daniel said, kneeling down to the boy's level. Are you hungry? We make really good pancakes here. Jake nodded shyly, then surprised everyone by asking, Are you the man who checks under beds for monsters? Daniel glanced up at Hale, who was smiling with something that looked like genuine warmth. How did you know about that? My dad told me. He said that's what good dads do. They keep kids safe from scary things. The simple statement carried profound implications. Hale had not only accepted Daniel's place in the community, but had also begun teaching his son to see him as a protector rather than a threat. As they settled into a booth and Daniel served fresh pancakes with extra syrup, Hale shared news that would reshape the community's understanding of recent events. Rick pled guilty to all charges yesterday, Hale said quietly. He'll serve 6 months in county jail and complete community service. He's also agreed to attend counseling to address the underlying issues that led to his behavior. Daniel nodded, feeling a complex mix of satisfaction and sadness. Justice had been served, but it came at the cost of a man's career and reputation, a family's stability and future. How is his family handling it? Daniel asked. Better than you might expect. His wife always suspected that his drinking and anger were symptoms of deeper problems. She's relieved that he's finally getting help, even if the circumstances aren't ideal. Over the following months, Millhaven slowly settled into a new equilibrium. The town hall hadn't converted all of Daniel's opponents into supporters, but it had established a framework for coexistence based on mutual respect rather than fear. Henderson continued to maintain his reservations about Daniel's presence, but he also stopped organizing protests or making public statements about community safety. His son Jake gradually stopped harassing Lily at school, and while they weren't friends, they managed to share the playground peacefully. Mrs. Chen's flower shop not only recovered from the vandalism, but actually thrived as community members made deliberate efforts to support her business. She and Daniel developed an unlikely friendship based on their shared experience of being outsiders who had found acceptance through persistence and grace. The real transformation, however, was visible in the smaller details of daily life. Daniel no longer tensed when he heard footsteps behind him on quiet streets. Lily began inviting classmates to their apartment for homework sessions and birthday parties. Martha started featuring Daniel's daily special on the diner's menu, highlighting his growing skills as a cook. Most significantly, Daniel began to see himself not as a former convict seeking redemption, but as a contributing member of a community that had chosen to judge him by his present rather than his past. The moment that crystallized this transformation came on a cold February morning, nearly a year after Daniel and Lily had first arrived in Millhaven. Daniel was opening the diner before dawn, as had become his routine when he heard shouting from the direction of Main Street. Through the early morning darkness, he could see orange flames flickering in the windows of Morrison's hardware store. Tom Morrison was standing outside in his pajamas and coat, yelling for help as smoke poured from the building that housed his life's work. Without hesitation, Daniel ran toward the fire, his protective instincts overriding any concerns about personal safety. As he reached the hardware store, he could see that the flames were concentrated in the back of the building near the paint and chemical storage area. "Tom, is anyone inside?" Daniel shouted over the sound of crackling flames. "No, thank God. But we've got to get the fire department here before it spreads to the other buildings." Daniel was already moving toward the store's entrance, his mind automatically cataloging potential hazards and escape routes. "Do you have a fire extinguisher? Something to buy time until the professionals arrive." "In the office, but Daniel, you can't go in there, it's too dangerous." But Daniel was already pushing through the front door, his body remembering the training he'd received years earlier in emergency response and crisis management. The smoke was thick, but not yet overwhelming, and he could see a path to the office where Morrison kept emergency equipment. He found 2 fire extinguishers and quickly deployed them against the flames in the storage area, not trying to extinguish the fire completely, but working to contain its spread until professional help arrived. The chemicals in the paint storage created toxic smoke, but Daniel held his breath and worked efficiently, his movements calm and purposeful despite the danger. By the time the volunteer fire department arrived, Daniel had managed to prevent the fire from spreading beyond the storage area. The building was saved along with Morrison's inventory and the adjacent structures that could have been threatened if the flames had grown. As the firefighters took over the scene, Daniel emerged from the building, covered in soot and smoke, coughing from the chemical fumes he'd inhaled. Tom Morrison grabbed him in a bear hug that spoke to emotions too deep for words. "You saved my business," Morrison said, his voice thick with gratitude. "You risked your life for my store." But it was the reaction of the growing crowd of neighbors and onlookers that truly marked Daniel's transformation from outsider to community member. People who had once viewed him with suspicion were now looking at him with something approaching awe, recognizing that he had risked his safety to protect a neighbor's livelihood. Mrs. Henderson, Jim's wife, approached Daniel with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said simply. "Tom and Carol are good people, and their store is important to this whole community. What you did running in there when you didn't have to, that's what neighbors do for each other." Over the following days, the story of Daniel's actions at the hardware store spread throughout Millhaven with the speed and embellishment that characterized all small-town news. But this time, the embellishment worked in his favor, transforming him from a man with a questionable past into a local hero who had risked everything to save a neighbor's business. The transformation was symbolized most powerfully at the annual Millhaven Community Day celebration that spring. Daniel had been reluctant to attend the festival, still uncertain about his place in the community's social fabric. But Lily had been selected to participate in the children's choir, and her performance was non-negotiable. As they walked through the booths and activities set up in the town park, Daniel was surprised by the warmth of the reception they received. People who had once averted their eyes now smiled and waved. Children who had been forbidden to play with Lily now ran up to her with invitations to join their games. The most meaningful moment came when Mayor Whitman approached them near the bandstand, where local musicians were performing. "Daniel, I have something for you," she said, producing an official-looking certificate. "The town council voted unanimously to present you with a Community Service Award in recognition of your actions at Morrison's hardware store and your contributions to our community over the past year." The certificate was a simple piece of paper, but it represented something profound, official recognition that Daniel Cross belonged in Millhaven, that his past had been weighed against his present, and found to be less important than his character and his commitment to his neighbors. As Daniel accepted the award, he felt Lily's small hand slip into his, squeezing tight with pride and love. Looking out at the crowd of faces, some still reserving judgment, others openly approving, all of them acknowledging his right to be there, Daniel realized that redemption wasn't a destination, but a journey, not a single moment of forgiveness, but a daily choice to be worthy of the trust others placed in him. That evening, as they walked home from the festival, Lily looked up at her father with the kind of serious expression that usually preceded important observations. "Daddy, do you remember when I said, you didn't just save Officer Hale, you chose to be human?" Daniel smiled at the memory. "I remember. I think I was wrong about that. I don't think you chose to be human that day. I think you were human all along, and you just helped other people see it." As they climbed the stairs to their apartment, no longer a temporary shelter, but truly their home, Daniel reflected on his daughter's words. She was right in the way that children often were about the fundamental truths adults complicated with analysis and doubt. He hadn't become a different person during their time in Millhaven. He had simply been given the opportunity to show who he really was beneath the label of convicted felon, who he had become through years of loving his daughter and trying to build a life worthy of her trust. The small town of Millhaven had changed during their first year there, becoming more open, more willing to look beyond surface judgments, more committed to the radical idea that people could grow beyond their mistakes. But perhaps the most significant change was in Daniel himself, not in his character or his values, but in his understanding of what it meant to belong somewhere, to be accepted, not despite his flaws, but as a complete human being whose past was part of his story, but not the end of it. As he tucked Lily into bed that night and performed their familiar ritual of checking for monsters, Daniel realized that the real monsters they'd been fighting weren't hiding under beds or in closets. They were the fears and prejudices that kept people apart, the assumptions that prevented communities from seeing the full humanity in their neighbors. Those monsters could be defeated, but only through the kind of daily courage that chose compassion over suspicion, understanding over judgment, hope over fear. In a small town in the heart of America, one man's quest for redemption had become a community's journey toward grace, proving that transformation was possible when people chose to see each other not as threats to be managed, but as neighbors to be embraced. The last light of evening faded from Lily's window as Daniel sat quietly beside her, listening to her peaceful breathing and feeling the deep satisfaction that came from knowing that tomorrow would bring another opportunity to prove himself worthy of the gift he'd been given, the chance to be home.